Hello, hello. Sorry, we're a little behind putting these out. Also, note that I think the way that REM set up everything this year might be different than previous years. So there might be a misalignment of uh, like concepts covered. So I don't know. You might just have to mix and match. Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so I honestly find this lecture, there's a lot of really difficult, like high octane concepts, and a lot of it's new stuff too. So you can't really lean as much on like your MCAT crutch prep. Really quick, we're gonna go into like fatty acid basics, linoleic acid, how it's a precursor for the arachidonic acid pathway, which does a million different things. Most important is like immune system inflammatory response, which we often try to like ramp down on with medications. Then how we break down fats, how we can build fats, how the liver can package up fats and little protein transporters, like LDL and HDL and whatnot. How we break down proteins. Now, note that this is probably not that important for your MBME, but you break down proteins into amino acids. And so we're going to briefly talk about, just fun facts about amino acids, the derivatives, things like, tyrosine makes phenylalanine, and then that can, make melanin. And then what happens if tyrosinase doesn't work? You get albinism. What happens if, blah, blah, blah. So we talked about breaking down proteins. You break down proteins, you get you have to deaminate them. You take off the nitrogen. Okay, well, nitrogen is really toxic. How do we get rid of that? The Cahill cycle and the urea cycle, which are linked, are going to help us safely excrete nitrogen as urea. We'll talk about that. And then nucleotides, how do we make them? How do we break them down? And then what the heck is the salvage pathway? All right, let's get into it. All right, here's our carbonyl carbon. This is basic orgo. This is the alpha carbon. That's the beta carbon. Now, if you go all the way over here, the very last carbon, doesn't matter how far away it is, that is the omega carbon. So here, this is carbon number 1, and there is 1 double bond. And now this double bond is 9 carbons from the final carbon. This is a little like confusing because there's also 9 carbons from the first one, but that's just a coincidence. So it's the last one we're talking about, 9 carbons from the last one. So this is 18 carbons long. It is 1 double bond, and it is 9 away from the omega. All right, let's see more. Carbonyl carbon. Here we'd have our alpha, here we'd have our beta. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 20 carbons, there's 5 double bonds, and this is an omega-3 because it's 1, 2, 3 away from the omega. This is also 1, 2, 3. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, hence omega-6. We can make a lot of fats. Mostly we make palmitate, but we can make a lot of them. Essential fats that we need to get from our diet are linoleic acid, which is an omega-6. This is really important as the precursor component for the arachidonic pathway. And alpha linoleic acid, which is an omega-3. And the arachidonic acid pathway. All right, there's a lot going on here. You can probably ignore most of it. Just know that most cells, cell membrane made of phospholipids, most cells are going to have some of these fatty acids be linoleic acid. And based on like whatever extracellular, what's going on around the cell, we can have certain responses, mediated, like a big domino effect. So phospholipase A2 will cleave that linoleic acid into arachidonic acid right off the phospholipid. And now this is a precursor which can make the leukotrienes, and then it can make the prostas and the thromboxanes. The leukotrienes, mostly this is, let's say you've got asthma, you're going to have like an enhanced and chronic inflammatory response. And bronchial tone just means bronchoconstriction. Your airways narrow, they close up, makes it hard to breathe. Neutrophil chemotaxis, just how do neutrophils like get into like the target site where they want to go and, out of the blood vessels. Then we have these prostacyclins. So if you're not getting enough blood flow to an area, you want more. Let's say you just get a wound, maybe, right? Like you get a sunburn, someone like bops you on the shoulder. You want more blood flow to heal that area. So you're going to decrease vascular tone, which just means vasodilation, more blood flow, and less platelets, because I want the blood to flow a little bit more. Note that this is the exact opposite of thromboxanes, which are like, okay, let's say I have like a brain aneurysm. I'm bleeding in my brain. We probably don't want to send as much blood to that vessel. So we're going to vasoconstrict, so less blood goes to this area, because why would you want to send blood if it's just going to leak out because there's hemorrhage? We also want more platelets. And it might seem weird that both of these come from the same precursor, which of course comes from arachidonic acid, but it actually makes sense if you really think about it. You don't want both of these pathways going on at the same time. So let's say I have a brain bleed. I'm going to, whatever enzyme makes thromboxanes, it's going to steal from the pool of whatever these cyclic enteroperoxides, which you don't need to know. But we're going to have this shunted this way, which means I now have less of this, and vice versa if you had ischemia and you wanted more blood flow to an area. So because they come from the same precursor, if you direct more towards one pathway, you're taking from the other pathway. So to me, that makes sense. Ignore. PGE2 is really important for like contractions, someone's going into labor during delivery. This is going to be helpful. It's pro-inflammatory, and that's mostly what we're going to talk about. What we're interested in. I have a headache or I got a boo-boo. I'm gonna take some Advil or something. And mucus as well. And mucus is going to be like in the stomach, so it's going to be inhibiting acid secretion and pushing out more mucus. Note that these are in different cells. The pro-inflammatory is PGE2 is only going to be in like immune cells. Well, the mucus PGE2 is mostly going to be in like stomach cells. So a lot of times, for whatever reason, your immune system is being like a piece of shit, pain in the ass. It's giving you a headache. It's giving you asthma. It's giving you lupus, right? So we might want to inhibit the immune system for various reasons. So we have a couple medications we can take. Some of these, are glucocorticoids or not. We make them, but we also take medications. Corticosteroids, and then we have COX-2 selective and the non-selective COX inhibitors. Note that the glucocorticoids is going to be the biggest effect and probably have the most side effects because it stops this at the very beginning. You don't get any of this or any of this. But if you just do these, you're only inhibiting potentially the prostas and the thromboxanes. We'll talk more about these here. So COX-1 is in most cells. And this is our friend. We like COX-1. It's things like vascular tone, vasoconstricting, vasodilating. Should we make mucus? Yes, I hope so, etc. There's a bunch of things. It's good. We do not want to inhibit this. COX-2, COX-2 is sometimes good, but right, like sometimes you sprain your ankle and you don't want to get too swollen and it's causing pain. So you want to ramp down on the inflammation there. So this is in immune cells. It is pro-inflammatory, sometimes good, sometimes overdoes it. So we might want to inhibit it. And so this is where we have these COX-2 selective medications, Vioxx, Saloxicib, Meloxicam. These are going to be COX-2 only. Notice that we don't have any COX-1 only because that doesn't really make sense, right? The objective here, we want to inhibit COX-2 because it makes the PGE2 in the immune cells, and that's inflammation, that's pain, that's fever. We don't want those things. Now we have in the middle of this Venn diagram things like aspirin, which are going to be a little bit COX-1 and a little bit COX-2. Specifically, this is going to acetylate, which just means it's a non-competitive inhibitor. And then ibuprofen works as a competitive inhibitor. Again, we want to inhibit COX-2, but sometimes we got to take COX-1 as like collateral damage, right? So ideally, we could just take these and only do COX-2. I'm also treating it as a binary, and that's kind of a lie. Some things are very COX-2 selective, and then some things are kind of in the middle. And I don't actually know what that is. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but I guess you could theoretically just be COX-1. So it's not binary, it is a spectrum. Lipolysis. Okay, so it's January 5th. You got a New Year's resolution. You want to lose weight. You haven't quit on it yet. You got a couple extra, lbs around the midsection from the winter holidays. What's going to happen? We have our adipocytes. We want to break down our the triglycerides into fatty acids, shown here, which have to, because they're nonpolar, ride on the back of albumin, and glycerol. Glycerol is going to go to the liver. It's going to do gluconeogenesis to become glucose, right? Maybe it's like 10 hours you haven't eaten or something. You're trying to get intermittent fasting. So that's one thing. The fatty acids go directly to the muscle, the heart, beta oxidation to generate ATP. They can also go to the liver, where they're just packaged up in this, just bundled up nicely and neatly into these little VLDLs. These are also sent to the skeletal muscle in the heart to do more beta oxidation. If we have more fatty acids, it's broken down into acetyl-CoA, which can generate ketones, ketogenesis. Those ketones can flow through the blood, and we can just get ketolysis in the muscles, ketolysis in the heart, generating energy. But the difference is we can also go to the brain and the blood. Fatty acids are not allowed through the blood-brain barrier, so we're not going to get any energy from the brain. And the fatty acid breakdown can't happen in a red blood cell because you need a mitochondria to do beta oxidation. So they can't use fatty acids in a state of extreme starvation. So this is just, that was the overview. Let's go into the specifics a little bit more. So this is fatty acid mobilization here. We have an adipocyte, hormone-sensitive lipase, right? This could be epinephrine. This could be glucagon. And I actually think the main one on this is just less insulin causes actually the main thing to affect this. Breaks down the triglyceride into fatty acids, puts them on the albumin, takes them through the blood, and gives them to the target cell, which is energy hungry. In actuality, it's a little bit more complicated. We really just take them off one at a time. Triglyceride becomes, diacylglycerol becomes monoglycerol. I'm just taking off a little fatty acid every time. And eventually we're going to take that last one off, and then the glycerol. Again, glycerol goes into gluconeogenesis. This is albumin to the cells for beta oxidation, or it can go to the liver where it's VLDL. Or it goes to the liver where ketogenesis happens. We got a lot of enzymes. Enzymes. I think the main one to know would be hormone-sensitive lipase. For whatever reason, that's just the one I always see the most. So now they get to the cell. We want to break down these fatty acids into something a little bit more bite-sized, into acetyl-CoA, which we can just put into the Krebs cycle. So remember, like one little tidbit about acetyl-CoA is it's never allowed to go back to the pyruvate. And one thing about that is it's the CoA actually it traps something. It's not allowed through a membrane. It's kind of similar to how when we put glucose into a cell, the first thing we do is hexokinase to make it glucose 6-phosphate. That traps it. So if fatty acid comes into the cell, boom, we slap it on with the CoA. That traps it in the cell. Cannot get through a membrane. Well, that's kind of a problem. I mean, we wanted to stay in the cell. That's good. But it's also a problem because, now I want it to go to the mitochondria. That's where beta oxidation happens. But again, it's got a CoA. It's not allowed through the membrane. So we have carnitine acyl transferase. Sometimes, so this is CAT1, sometimes called CPT1 because acyl just means fatty acid, and the main fatty acid that we have is palmitate. So carnitine acyl transferase is really just also carnitine palmitate transferase. So we swap the CoA for carnitine, and that allows it now into the cell. Well, now it doesn't really need the carnitine anymore. So immediately the first thing to happen is we're just going to, just put the CoA back on it because we don't want it to go backwards. Right now it cannot go through the membrane. So we just make it back to a CoA, and the carnitine just goes back to where it was. So this is CAT2 or CPT2. So these are right back to back, right? The picture actually makes it look like they're farther apart. They're like both right in the, right by the membrane. Something to know about CPT1, it is the rate limiting enzyme. And as such, it's highly regulated. So what the heck is malonyl-CoA? Well, we'll come to this. This is when you're doing fatty acid synthesis, which is the exact opposite thing, right? Fatty acid breakdown is I'm hungry and I need energy. Fatty acid synthesis is that was a couple weeks ago when I'm eating the candy cane and like the, Christmas turkey or whatever you're eating. And so if you're building fat, you have a lot of malonyl-CoA. And so it would make not a lot of sense to be building fat and breaking down fat at the same time. So malonyl-CoA from the anabolic pathway goes ahead and inhibits the catabolic pathway so that you don't have separate streams going. So now we have this fatty acid, or actually, let's see. Another quick note is we have a lot of fatty acids. There's a large variety. The main one would be palmitate, which is 16-0, right? 16 carbons, no double bonds. But there's short fatty acids, medium fatty acids, long fatty acids, and very long fatty acids, which are going to go to the peroxisome. And medium chain and long chain in normal cells go through the mitochondria with the acyl-CoA and the carnitine, blah, blah, blah. But if something's really small and nonpolar, it can just diffuse through membranes. The medium and long are a little bit too far to diffuse, which is why they need the whole carnitine to shuttle them in, right? I guess I'm just thinking this now. You can think of the car, shuttle, right? Same thing. So carnitine, car is kind of like a shuttle. It brings it in. All right, so now we have the fatty acyl-CoA, right? Again, so we had a fatty acid. We put it in the cell. CoA traps it. Good, but also bad because now it can't get through the mitochondrial membrane. Okay, we'll just put on a carnitine and take off the carnitine. That shuttles it in. Now put the CoA back on because I don't want it to go out, right? So it all kind of makes sense if you think about it. Okay, now it's in the mitochondrial matrix. Let's break it down. We have the short chain dehydrogenase, the medium chain dehydrogenase and the long chain dehydrogenase. This might be the part that you remembered on the MCAT. This is technically specifically the beta. Everything else is how do we get it in, et cetera. Or get it from the fat cell to here, and then how do we get it in the mitochondria? This is now beta oxidation, where we're doing like the oxidation and the hydrolysis and the oxidation and the breaking. Now, the main idea is that we want to break it down to acetyl-CoA. And as we said, acetyl-CoAs in the liver can be made to be ketones, which we can ship through the blood and feed the muscles, but also, importantly, feed the brain and the hearts. Or it's acetyl-CoA. So any cell can just do Krebs cycle and generate ATP with this. So a little bit more on this right over here. So these enzymes, let's just pretend like it's one. They're all doing the same thing, just for different lengths. So these, chain dehydrogenases are going to have 4 steps. So we're first going to oxidize something. And look at this. We got a carbon with 4 hydrogens. Now we're going to oxidize it. What do you know? There's only 2 hydrogens. Then we're going to hydrate it. Okay, well, here I have, just no OH, and here I have an OH. Great. So that was the hydration step. Let's oxidize this. Okay, again, here's an OH. Boom. Here's a double bond O. It's been oxidized. And I have less hydrogens. Oxidation is just kind of more bonds to oxygen and less bonds with carbon and hydrogen is the way I would think of it. And then thiolysis, the last step, we are now breaking off an acetyl-CoA. And then we're repeating this, right? It's a cycle. So every time you do this cycle, the carbon, the chain, the fatty acid is going to get 2 carbons shorter, right? Because an acetyl-CoA is 2 carbons. So, and each turn is going to generate an FADH2. Boom, that's an FADH2. And an NADH, there's my NADH. And as we just said, we have our acetyl-CoA. So every turn generates an FADH2, an NADH, and an acetyl-CoA. Okay, so let's imagine we had a fatty acid that's 10 carbons long. So 10 divided by 2, that's 5, right? Actually not. 10 divided by 2, sure, is 5. But there's 4 cycles. And so that means we're actually just going to get 4 FADH2, 4 NADH. You produce 4 acetyl-CoA here, but remember, you have at the end just a fatty acid left over. You're ending with the 2 carbon. You don't need to do that 5th cycle. You just got an acetyl-CoA automatically without doing the 5th cycle. So just think if you have 10, you're trying to go to 2, 10, 8, 6, 4, 2. That's the first cycle, the second cycle, the third, the fourth. You don't need to do a 5th cycle because, again, you end up, your final thing is 2 carbons. That's an acetyl-CoA, you're done. So if we palmitate the main one, 16 carbons, 16 carbons would be 7 cycles. So I get 7 FADH2. Each one of these is 1.5. That's 10.5. 7 NADH. That's 2.5. So that's 17.5. And you generate 7 acetyl-CoAs, but at the end you're just left with that last one. So you have 8 acetyl-CoAs. Each one is about 10 ATP. So boom, that's how much you get. So ideally, we would like to do an even breakdown, but what if we do an odd breakdown? So odd is also going to happen in the mitochondria. So 11 to 9 to 7 to 5 to 3. Oh no, we don't know what to do with 3, or maybe we do, but it's just more work. And remember, propane is 3, so propionyl-CoA makes sense. The propionyl, so it's hard to deal with odd numbers for whatever reason, so we're going to do a carboxylase. Anytime you do a carboxylase, you have biotin. So I would just notice, anytime you see malonyl, it always means 3. And so this is now methyl malonyl. Methyl is 1 and malonyl is 3. So now it's 4 carbons. It's something we can deal with again. This is going to be generated into succinyl-CoA, which can just, it's part of the Krebs cycle. Or if you're in the liver, you can just go ahead and do gluconeogenesis, make some glucose. And remember, it's also important for heme generation. Now, there's an important note on this B12 right here. If this B12 is missing, if you have a B12 deficiency, this enzyme can't work. So what happens? The levels of this go up. Okay, who cares? Why do we care? We'll get to one sec. So if the B12 is not there, methylmalonic acid goes up. Who cares? Well, keep in mind that if you also have a B12 or a folate deficiency, we can't do this. So that doesn't work. So that is also going to go up. So B12 would cause homocysteine to go up as well, but also so would folate. Remember that folate and cobalamin, B12, they do a lot of similar things, right? They're both involved in this very important kind of like methylation stepway process that affects hematopoietic cells. It causes megaloblastic anemia, but we really want to differentiate them, and that's a very high yield. So hopefully we can see then that homocysteine causes both of these levels to go up. Homocysteine goes up if you have a B9 or B12 deficiency, but you only have the methylmalonic go up in the B12 deficiency. So what if we have a carnitine or an MCAD deficiency? These are going to be two common fatty acid breakdown deficiencies. And yeah, those two, but for whatever reason, it's mainly this one or carnitine. So MCAD, the enzyme, just doesn't work as well. And carnitine, I think the idea is that you for whatever reason, you're peeing more carnitine out, like the transporters to get them back into the bloodstream. It's just not working as well. So you lose more of them than you'd like. So both of these are going to have really similar symptoms, right? At the end of the day, right, we have, fatty acid, we trap it. We have our car is a shuttle. We get it in here, right? That's CPT1, then CPT2. Now we got it here. Now we do beta oxidation, right? So we have this, and we have this is not functioning. Well, one, you're going to have hypoketosis because in the liver, acetyl-CoA can make ketones and blah, blah, blah. So you can't have that happen if you don't have as much acetyl-CoA, and you won't get acetyl-CoA if either of these, one or two, is not working. And if that's the case, well, you might have, you also can't beta oxidation. You're going to have less energy because you don't have ketones. You're going to have less energy, especially because you can't do beta oxidation in your muscles and your heart. So you're going to have muscular weakness. And you know what? If you don't use it, you lose it. Hypotonia, you're going to lose muscle tone. And there are a lot of different ways to think about this next one, but the easiest one is, okay, we don't have ketones. We don't have fats. Our body still has to keep us alive. So there's still a lot of energy demand. So we're just going to be really consuming all of the sugar in our blood, way more than we would like. So you're going to become quite hypoglycemic. Now, what's going to be a buildup? If you have carnitine issues, well, then you're going to have fatty acid accumulate in the cell, right? Because where do you stop? You stop right over here. Fatty acyl-CoA, and you can't put the carnitine on it. And remember that CoA traps it, so it's just trapped in the cell. It can't really go anywhere. And this is going to happen a lot in the myocytes because that's where you have lots of fatty acid. So a lot of these fatty acid, acyl-CoAs stuck in the myocytes. If you have an MCAD deficiency, okay, well, this works. So we can shuttle it in to the matrix. But you now can't do this. This doesn't work. Oh, crap. Well, remember that one of the things about the carnitine is that if carnitine is attached to it, it can move through. The car is a shuttle. It can move through the membranes. So if it can't be broken down, it's gonna build up, and I'm sure it's more complicated. There's some sort of regulation, but the carnitine can be attached. We just can't break it down, but it can move. It can move through the membranes here, and it can move out of the cell as well. And so you're actually going to find a little bit of these acyl carnitine structures in the blood. Somehow the breakdown of this generates a dicarboxylic acid. That's super high yield. You see dicarboxylic acid, you have an MCAD issue. Now the treatment, remember that carnitine is we're like peeing too much out, but we're getting some back, right? It's not binary. So just supplement carnitine in the diet, and I guess if you have enough carnitine, it's going to raise the levels, and that can fix it. If you have an MCAD issue, remember that hypoglycemic is a big one. So if you just avoid fasting, just constantly have a high carb diet, that theoretically could be enough to fuel your muscles and your body and everything. Because you don't really need ketones to the brain and red blood cells if you have enough glucose. And I guess if you have enough glucose, you don't really need to do beta oxidation either. Ketogenesis. So ketogenesis, a lot of stuff. So we're taking acetyl-CoAs and we're making lots of cool stuff. Only really important enzyme to recognize here is the HMG-CoA synthase. This can generate acetoacetate and also beta-hydroxybutyrate. Those are the important downstream ketones to know. And the ketone, it's really just a shuttling mechanism because, again, acetyl-CoA is trapping it. You're not allowed it through the membrane if you have a CoA. So problem is we want to get energy to our brain or to our muscles because we haven't eaten in forever. But you can't. You got all this CoA and you need to do something. So HMG-CoA synthase is going to make acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate. These are allowed into the blood. They go for a swim. They're going to move through all your body. Acetone is very volatile, so this can be breathed out. People can smell that. The acetoacetates then go into. So this is like a bug, not a feature. The ketones here, the acetoacetate, the beta-hydroxybutyrate. They just go into the muscles where they're just broken down and they make acetyl-CoA, and then that's great. We can just use acetyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle, make energy for our muscles. Again, as we said, Fats not allowed through the blood-brain barrier. Red blood cells do not have mitochondria, so you cannot do beta oxidation. Um, uh, we have our alpha carbon here. Alpha carbons, due to resonance, are very acidic. So we can lose this hydrogen. We have this, which means we have an H plus floating around. Where is it floating around? Probably in the blood. This is going to cause acidosis, ketoacidosis, often said to be diabetic ketoacidosis, though there are other causes. So remember Le Chatelier's principle, we can actually kind of ignore this one. So just to notice the left side and the right side, reactants, products. Problem is that we're generating too much of this H+. So we're going to have a Le Chatelier shift this way. I'm going to have less of this. So the bicarb is going to go down and the CO2 is going to go up. And if the CO2 goes up, your body doesn't want too much CO2, so it's gonna tell you to get rid of it. How do you get rid of it? You're gonna start hyperventilating. There's a very specific cause and sound and type of hyperventilation. It's called Kussmaul breathing. And as we just said, that the ketones are kind of volatile, so this can create like this fruity breath odor. You're just on a keto diet, a low sugar diet could theoretically cause this. Diabetes as well. Now, type 1, type 2, because I think for really to be diabetic ketoacidosis, you got to have a crazy low blood sugar. You got to have crazy low blood. So you could have it with type 2. Type 2, remember, is you still got insulin. The receptors are just not working as well. It'd have to be really advanced type 2 for it to be diabetic ketoacidosis. And I'm not even sure about the low sugar diet. Like, I don't know, maybe it's possible. But the main one to know is diabetes type 1. You could also get it with a von Gierke's disease. So this is where glucose 6-phosphatase isn't working in the liver. Remember that this is pushing glucose from the liver out. So that means that glycogen in the liver cannot feed the rest of the body, right? Glycogen broke down to glucose, we need to push it out. You cannot push it out if the glucose 6-phosphatase is not working. You also can't do gluconeogenesis in the liver. Now, we have a lot of other glycogen storage diseases like Cory's, but these aren't going to be as bad because, now we can't get the glycogen broken down, but you can still do gluconeogenesis, right? So this one, glycogen isn't working and gluconeogenesis isn't an option. Here it's just glycogen. Again, though, really the main one is diabetes type 1 causes ketoacidosis. If you're an alcoholic, you just drink a lot, it might be more complicated, but this is at least how I remembered it. And at the end of the day, if you just know the effects, it's probably enough. A malate goes to OAA, last step of the Krebs cycle. NAD plus becomes NADH. Remember, just classic negative feedback, right? If we have a lot of NAD plus, not a lot of NADH, this reaction is very favorable. Now, if I have a lot of the product, this reaction might not run forwards, but it's actually might even be further than that because these reactions are often reversible. So actually, if I have a lot of NADH, I theoretically, I might not, I either won't generate OA or the OA might go backwards. In either case, my OAA level is going to go very low. Remember that OAA's job is to combine with acetyl-CoA to make citrate. And so I can't put acetyl-CoA. This is the whole point of acetyl-CoA is put it in the Krebs cycle. So if you can't do that, the acetyl-CoA is going to build up. And in your liver, if you have too much acetyl-CoA, your body's like, I guess we'll just turn it into fat. So you're going to do fatty acid synthesis, ship it off to the adipocytes. So you're going to get fat deposition. Additionally, what can you do with acetyl-CoA? You can make ketones in the liver. So this is where you have an alcoholic breath, and again, a metabolic ketoacidosis might ensue. And again, alcohol is just oxidized, generates an NADH. It's oxidized once more, generates another NADH. So too much NADH tricks your body into making fats and making ketones. Because it doesn't know what to do with all this acetyl-CoA. All right, so short chain, medium chain, long chain, all can be broken down in normal cells, in like muscles mostly, in the beta, in the mitochondrial matrix. But if you have a very, very long chain, like over 21 or something, this goes to the peroxisome. Also, if you have a branched fatty acid, right? Fatty acids are normally like this, but I guess if you have a something like that, then this would also go to the peroxisome. For whatever reason, this breakdown generates lots of hydrogen peroxide, which is quite dangerous. We don't like this reactive oxygen species. So we have catalase to help reduce it and turn it into water. And so it's not a big deal. Very, 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 very long chain fatty acids. They're still normal fatty acids. So it's still beta oxidation. It's just happening in the peroxisome. But it's a different pathway for the branched fatty acids. So those are in the peroxisome, but we now call this alpha for the branched ones. Peroxisomes do a couple other things. They can help conjugate it, and they can generate a plasmalogen, which is just something important for myelin, and they play a role in steroid genesis as well. So a lot of diseases, most of these diseases are really just going to have to do with this, right? For whatever reason, certain phenotypes, like certain aspects are exaggerated, or those are things that the NBME might focus on, or first aid's focusing on, but it's going to screw up your liver bile stuff. It's going to screw up your nervous system because of the myelin, and it's going to screw up steroidogenesis, which is the testes and the ovaries making their sex hormones, and the adrenal glands, the adrenal cortex making cortisone, aldosterone, et cetera. So, that's probably most of it. If you know that, you'll be fine. Now I'm going to go into some specifics. Zellweger syndrome, this is going to be the worst one. Why? Because you're just not getting any peroxisomes. If you don't have any peroxisomes, you're screwed. And these kids die, I think, within less than a year. So, they might say failure to thrive, which just means it's not growing, it's not developing, and it probably will die. Very long chain fatty acids accumulate, and well, that's because they need to be broken down in the peroxisome, and it's just that's not there. Now, why? Like, would branched chain fatty acids also accumulate? Yes. Why doesn't first aid or other videos talk about this? It's probably just the case that very long chain fatty acids are more common than branched chain, and so that's just the thing they focus on. So just keep take a grain of salt. Think about this when you're sometimes they'll say something and it's just why do they say this and not this? And it might be just some sort of like boring nebulous reason behind that. That's at least how I interpret this. Hepatomegaly. I would assume because you're bringing bile into the liver, but you're then not able to conjugate it to push it out. So the liver might swell up, and if we don't have bile, we're going to get jaundice and central nervous system issues. We said no plasmalogen, you can't generate myelin. X-linked, okay, just know it's X-linked. Adrenal glands. Remember, we can't make steroids. Leuko, why leuko? Like leukocyte? Yeah, but it's not the immune system. A leukocyte is just a white blood cell. White here just means myelin. Myelin is white. So this is specifically the beta oxidation of the very long chain fatty acids. So over time, these are going to accumulate. So someone's like 8 or 9, they're fine. But when they turn 10, maybe not 10, but like as they reach early adolescence, now the fatty acids are accumulating that they're going to have all of these symptoms. So the accumulation over time is going to screw up, as we said, the adrenal glands and all of this stuff is just not going to work, as we said. Testes, not going to work. CNS, no plasmalogen, because your peroxisomes, like your cells die, your peroxisomes are going to stop working if they're too swollen with very long chain fatty acids that they can't break down. Nervous system issues. And there's a great movie based on a true story about like this boy in, I don't know, like 70s or 80s who had adrenal leukodystrophy. Normal boy, but until he turns like 10, he starts having all of these symptoms start to show up, and he gets really sick. And the dad, this is a real dad, real son, was a banker, no scientific background, and was really frustrated because the doctors were just saying, like, there's nothing we can do for him. And as a banker, he somehow came to the conclusion, helped invent something called Lorenzo's oil for his son Lorenzo, where I think it's just some sort of like long chain fatty acid, and it competes with an enzyme that generates very long chain fatty acid. So the very long chain fatty acid accumulation will be slower. It's a beautiful movie and a beautiful story, and it just seems like every image you find on the internet is just the guy like loving and kissing his son. And I thought it was beautiful. His son died in 2008, and then he died in like 2013 and at like 80. And I just, in my head, I thought like, I don't know, he held on just long enough to like take care of his son, and then he could let go. That's me being a boring romantic, but it's just such a sweet story. I thought it was worth sharing. Refsums, we have decreased alpha oxidation. Remember, this is branched chain fatty acids. You get a buildup of something called phytanic acid. Also, over time, accumulates, peroxisomes don't work. CNS issues, probably other issues too, but this is the one they focus on. Shortened fourth toe, that's going to be the giveaway. They mentioned that, it's Refsum. Okay, well, that's all she wrote for breaking down fats, but what about the other side of the coin? What about, building up fats? So acetyl-CoA is the precursor here, and fatty acid synthesis is going to take place in the cytosol. And this seems weird, right? Because wasn't our whole point is that CoA is not ever allowed through the membrane, right? So how does that work? We have another shuttle, right? We just have another shuttle. So we use citrate as a temporary intermediate, which can move through the membrane, and then we just turn it back into a CoA. So acetyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle combines with oxaloacetate, OA, the very first step, and it makes citrate. And usually the citrate, goes isocitrate, goes to alpha ketoglutarate, but the citrate can leave. It can go through this little nice citrate shuttle. It's allowed through. Okay, that's it. We don't need the citrate anymore. The only point is to get it through. So let's just convert it back to acetyl-CoA. Boom. Wait, how do we convert it back to acetyl-CoA? Which is the exact opposite of this process, right? Acetyl-CoA combines with OA to make citrate. So if I want to break apart citrate, it's just going to give me one OA and one acetyl-CoA. All right, now OA fucks off. We're done with that. So now the acetyl-CoA, for reasons I don't understand, we have to do a little carboxylase thing. And whenever we have a carboxylase, boom, we got biotin. So acetyl-CoA makes malonyl-CoA, which is then going to further be built up into larger like palmitate type structures, which we'll talk about in a second. Keep in mind that malonyl-CoA is a major inhibitor of the rate limiting step of fatty acid breakdown, right? The other path, the catabolic pathway, not the anabolic pathway. Why would that make sense? Because again, you don't want to be crossing the streams. Why would you be doing anabolic and catabolic at the same time? So it makes sense that if you have a lot of malonyl-CoA, it's an indicator that you're probably doing fatty acid synthesis, in which case you don't also want to be doing fatty acid breakdown. Where does fat, where are we making fats? Liver does any sort of metabolic thing, right? It can make fats, put them in VLDLs and send them into the rest of the tissues. Lactating mammary glands, for reasons I don't really understand. And then adipose tissue, obviously, that's the whole point. Let's just store the fats there. All right, let's just keep in mind, we want to do gluconeogenesis. Pyruvate, for whatever, the last enzyme of a glycolysis is irreversible. So we got to go through a different route. For some reason, we got to carboxylate it to make it OA before it can be shipped backwards through gluconeogenesis. This one's also weird, but I guess can kind of understand it a little bit. Propynyl-CoA is odd chain fatty acid, is something that usually you end up with acetyl-CoA, but 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, but now we have 11, 9, 7, 5, 3. I feel like that's a test like an officer would do if you had a DUI, right? Instead of do the alphabet backwards, they're like, do this beta oxidation thing backwards. So this is another one for the propynyl-CoA. We have to make it methyl malonyl. Remember, malonyl is 3 and methyl is 1, so this is 1, 3, 4. And now here's the last one, acetyl-CoA. And of course, all biotin B7. Acetyl-CoA is made to malonyl-CoA, is something we're going to ship into for fatty acid synthesis. So now we're going to do beta reduction. And this is really just the opposite of beta oxidation, right? Remember, beta oxidation, put in acetyl-CoA in the mitochondrial matrix. We do oxidation, we do hydration, oxidation, and then we use sulfur to basically break, not break in half, but break off 2. Break off 2, break off 2, break off 2. Well, this is beta reduction, so it's really just the exact opposite. This is happening in the matrix. This is happening in the cytosol. Remember, acetyl-CoA is not allowed out, but we make it citrate, and then we take it out, and then it's acetyl-CoA, and then it's malonyl-CoA, and now we're doing beta reduction. So this is the exact opposite. We're going to be reduction, dehydration, reduction, condensation. Condensation meaning adding to. I'm not even really going to go through all of this, but we have an acetyl-CoA and a malonyl-CoA, and repeat 7 times, right? Why repeat 7 times? Because we're making a palmitate, and we're starting off with 2. So, if taking 16, 14, 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, I swear I only had 2 drinks, officer. 2, right? That's only 7 cycles. So going the reverse would be the same, right? 2, 4, 8, wait, 2, 4, oh my God. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 is also 7 cycles. So just the exact opposite. That's what I would know. I would know mostly we're going to make palmitate, which is a saturated fatty acid. Why? Because there is no double bonds there. 16 carbons long. Pretty much the same thing, right? We're taking an acetyl-CoA, an OA, we make it a citrate. Why? So we can shuttle it through. Okay, we're done with your citrate. Let's get back to our acetyl-CoA. We're going to push off this little OA there, which can probably go back. Here's our acetyl-CoA. For reasons that are above my pay grade, we're going to use biotin to add a carbon group. Malonyl always means 3. For some reason, this is an input. So now we take this malonyl, blah, blah, blah. We put it into beta reduction, exact opposite of beta oxidation. Now we have an acyl-CoA. Acyl just means fatty acid. Probably palmitate, 16 carbons long. Now this could happen again. We said this can happen in lactating breast tissue. This can happen in fats. Let's just imagine this one's happening in the liver. So if this is happening in the liver, maybe we want to shift this to the fat so then the fat can store it. So we're probably going to put it on a VLDL, which is holding a lot of these fats, and then we can ship it to the fat, which can store it a little bit more permanently. So now it gets to the fat, and we need to, the same way we did fatty acid mobilization, which is like, let's break down a triglyceride Glycerol goes to the liver for gluconeogenesis. The three fatty acids go to albumins, and then they can go to the liver or the muscle or wherever. Remember when we're ripping off the fatty acids, we rip them off one at a time. And this is the exact same. We're gonna add them one at a time. So an acyl CoA and a glycerol, we're gonna add one and then two. And remember that when you have two fatty acids on a glycerol, it's basically just a phospholipid. So you can make a phospholipid, or you could keep going and you get to a triacylglycerol. I don't really think you need to know, like, we're just know it's one at a time. I don't think this is that high yield. And then just kind of a review. So we have an adipocyte. We want to store our triglycerides here. You could just push glucose in. The glucose can make DHAP, which is just DAP. That can make glycerol. But you can also, glucose can go ahead and make pyruvate, which can make acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can make fatty acids in the adipocyte. And then those could, here's our acyl-CoA. And these could combine, you add one, you add two, and then you add the third one, and now we have a triglyceride stored here. However, we're probably going to have very, very little. Glucose probably isn't going to be making the majority here. The majority of this is probably fats you just ate, like a, big fatty steak or something, fried chicken. Or a VLDL is that your liver's already said, hey, like, it's a good assistance. Like, I already did all the work for you. You just need to, cash it in or store it or whatever. So the VLDL has made the fatty acids, stored them in this little lipoprotein particle, ships them through the blood, and now the fatty acids come in, and acyl-CoA is just a fatty acid, and it's going to be combined, and again, triglycerol. Review, summary. All right, so we have acetyl-CoA to citrate. Why citrate? Because it's not allowed through if it has a CoA. Boom, we push it through, goodbye citrate, we're back to acetyl-CoA. Reasons I don't understand, we add one, we got malonyl-CoA. Malonyl-CoA goes through beta oxidation, we got our palmitate. Remember that malonyl-CoA, if we're doing synthesis, we probably don't also want to be doing degradation. So what about the degradation? My muscle is very hungry now, so we're shipping it a bunch of fatty acids. And you know what? If a cell has a lot of fatty acids, we're probably doing degradation, and so we don't also want to be doing synthesis. Also, though, another way to interpret this is that we've just done enough synthesis. We made enough of these, and so this is just classic negative feedback. That might even be more common. I don't know, but just no fatal fatty acyl-CoA. Acyl-CoAs can inhibit that. Anyways, back to here. We have our fatty acyl-CoA. Oh no, CoA is not allowed through the membrane. What are we going to do? Well, instead of making citrate now, we just have the car for shuttle carnitine, which is, CPT1, rate limiting step. Put the carnitine on. It's now allowed through. Immediately CP2, CPT1 and CPT2, also known as CAT1 and CAT2, right back to back. Put the carnitine on, take the carnitine off. Okay, now we're back to a CoA. Now just beta oxidation, oxidation, hydration, oxidation, thiolysis. We have an acetyl-CoA. This can go to the Krebs cycle, or if you're in your liver, you can make ketones bodies. It's in that everywhere, but especially important, the brain and the red blood cells get some. All right, so I have not eaten in a couple hours. I am using a lot of... So you're always, let's just make a point. You're always breaking down like proteins and fats and sugar at the same time. It's never trinary, right? It's complex, like a little bit of all of them. So when we do this, we're really simplifying it to, and this is probably what you see in the test. So we can imagine that if you have not eaten in a few hours, your body is just using the free glucose in your blood, or the muscles have their own glycogen and the liver has glycogen it can break down and send to the body. That is probably the first thing. Now, if you haven't eaten in like a couple more hours, like 16 hours or so, really in the first. So first is glycogenolysis. Then a little bit later in the day, you're still doing glycogenolysis. You start doing gluconeogenesis. Again, we're always doing gluconeogenesis, but you're doing way more gluconeogenesis than you were. Remember, this is the MacGyver. We're just taking glycerol, we're taking amino acids, we're taking just random shit in the liver, making new glucose, push into the blood, feeding everybody. But you run out of your carbon stores really quickly. So meaning mainly your glycogen. All right, so now the next week or so, you're doing gluconeogenesis. Wait, didn't we just say we're running out of carbon stores? Yeah, no, carbon stores, glycogen. Gluconeogenesis is the MacGyver. We're taking glycerol, we're taking all this random shit. So you're still going to be doing gluconeogenesis, and then you're going to start breaking down your fats. And now, of course, this is going to vary. It just depends how big you are, right? How much extra meat do you got? And then eventually, finally, after a couple of weeks, your body's going to really start making a lot more ketones, especially because the brain and the red blood cells have a hard time dealing with the fat. So carbohydrates go first. Depending on how much fat you have, that goes next. And then the protein's like really, you spent a lot of time at the gym trying to, build some good biceps or something. Your body's aware of that. And it's like, last thing I want to do is shred our biceps because we're like, hungry and starving in the Amazon. But at a certain point, it's like, fuck your biceps. We're going to break down that stuff. And of course, not just your biceps, but like proteins are important. It took a lot of effort to make them in any cell. And so we really don't want to break them down unless we absolutely need to. That's why proteins go last. Lipoproteins. There is a lot of stuff here. I don't know. I think it's pretty interesting, and it's really not as bad as it seems. If you just try to like memorize things, I think it makes it a lot harder. There should be a little bit of rhyme and reason. It just makes it go down a little bit smoother. So we'll try to break it down. These are the biggest. Smaller, smallest, right? The main difference in terms of size has to do with the amount of lipids, right? So we're increasing the number of lipids on the left side and we have less on the right side. And one, proteins are more dense, but two, you can think of it as the density, the number of proteins compared to lipids. So here's a lot of lipids. So there's a low density of proteins. Here, there's not a lot of lipids. There's a high density of proteins. That's always how I thought of it. Now, this name, whoever came up with this is either very stupid or very evil. They call this an intermediate density. And so I always thought like, okay, high density, low density, it belongs over there. That is not the case. It is intermediate between VLDL and LDL, which makes sense because this becomes this and this becomes this as they shed lipids. And we'll get into all of this. It should also make sense that the high density lipoprotein is mostly proteins and not a lot of lipids. It does have a role in taking up lipids, but its main role is carrying around a bunch of proteins and giving them to the other lipoproteins. So this is like a basic schematic. You eat a bunch of lard and brownies and whatnot, so a lot of fat comes in. It's packaged into kilomicrons. This is now going to deposit triglycerides into triacylglycerols into just tissue, various tissue, fats, muscles, who cares. Now it's called a chylomicron remnant. It's just, it's still got some fat, but it's just a leftover thing. It is now going to be taken up by the liver. Now separately, they're kind of related, but like, all right, now new event, separate event, the liver can exocytose VLDL. VLDL, which has triglycerides and a little bit of cholesterol, can lose that triglycerides to become an IDL, which is really, it's just a VLDL remnant is really what it is. And again, this is intermediate density between this and this. This IDL now, this is now a little hazy. A couple different things can happen. It can lose triglycerides to the liver. It can be taken up by the liver and modified, or it can trade with an HDL via a CETP. Really not that important. It will somehow now become an LDL. And LDLs are mostly cholesterol. You should definitely know that. And cholesterol is really the main thing that's contributing to atherosclerosis in the blood vessels. This LDL now is going kind of on a suicide mission to the tissues where it will deliver this cholesterol and be absorbed and then degraded. That's an overview, and then there's a million different proteins we need to know. We'll get into it. So B100, and B48, they play some nebulous role in stabilizing, blah, blah, blah. We don't really care about that. The main thing we want to focus is that the 100, so it's 100 because it's the 48 is 48% of the amino acids of the 100. How is that possible? Was it a splicing thing? No, it's actually post-transcriptional editing. We make a premature stop codon. So we get 48% of the whole thing. Okay, well, we're losing that other 52%. What kind of information is there? What domains of the protein? The only thing we really need to know is it has the LDL binding receptor. So the LDL receptor is on certain cells, and it grabs on to this domain of the ApoB100 and pulls it in. But it doesn't do that for the 48. Again, the 48 is missing that. So all I would know for the 100 is it has the LDL receptor ligand. The 48 does not. It is missing it. And then we have, so this is apolipoprotein 100, apolipoprotein B48, apolipoprotein. So just E. I think of E for exiting. Exiting where? Exiting to the liver specifically. And this has an important association with Alzheimer's. So ApoE4, I always think of like 4 as forget. And then ApoE2, it's kind of silly, but Game of Thrones, they always say, the North remembers. Well, the North, it's 2 words, hence ApoE2, remembers, remembering. So ApoE4 is bad. If you have ApoE4, you're more likely to get Alzheimer's. ApoE2 is a good allele. You're less likely to get Alzheimer's. It's protective. Apolipoprotein C2 is for, and of course, again, all of these are just on scattered, interesting distributions, which we'll get into on various lipoproteins. C2 is for cleaving. So as the lipoproteins are floating through the blood, they're going to interact with lipases, which are going to be inactive unless turned on by the C2. So the C2 helps the lipoprotein lipase become active, which is going to then cleave the triglycerides. And that means that a chylomicron will shed fats because they're being cleaved and become a chylomicron remnant. A VLDL will have its triglyceride cleaved, becoming an IDL, really just a VLDL remnant. And again, IDL is kind of tricky about how it becomes an LDL. It could actually be a hepatic lipase, which is sort of a different thing. Now, ApoE and ApoC2 are gifts from the HDL. HDL is a nice guy. It's a nice guy, and it's the good one for us, right? HDL is the good cholesterol, LDL is the bad one. And one of the reasons, so it's good in that it's healthy, but it's good also in that it's nice and it's gifting things. It's gifting E and C2 to other lipoproteins. So let's go ahead and play this out. A chylomicron has an ApoB48. What is 48? 48 means that it doesn't interact with the LDL receptor. It's not going to be taken up, absorbed, endocytosed by various cells and degraded. That's not its job. Its job is to give fats while still in the blood and then go to the liver. ApoC2, well, we want to cut those fats and get them off the chylomicron, so we need this to help cleave with the lipoprotein lipase. ApoE, yeah, I just said it gets taken up by the liver, so it needs an ApoE. ApoB100, what is the 100? It will ultimately interact with the LDL receptor on a normal cell, be taken up and degraded. But not yet, right? And actually, let's talk about this. VLDL becomes an IDL. The IDL is still not taken up by a normal cell. It becomes the LDL, and it's the LDL. So because this becomes this, the ApoB100 is not actually really useful in terms of the LDL until we get to the last version, the LDL. The LDL is taken up into the cell and degraded. ApoC2, yeah, we have a lot of triglycerides we want to cut. ApoE, well, the VLDL becomes the IDL when it loses a lot of its lipids. The ApoE is transformed sometimes in the LDL by being taken up. In other words, E for exit, it's exiting from the bloodstream, going to the liver, it gets modified, then it gets pushed right back out as an LDL. And the HDL, we'll talk about this later, it has an ApoC2 and an ApoE, but not to use, not for itself. It's gifting these, it's giving these, and sometimes taking them back from the other lipoproteins. And here we can just kind of see a basic blueprint of what a lipoprotein looks like. All right, so this whole thing again, we're going to get into it. We're going to break down. It should make more sense. Before we get into it, let's just really make clear a lipoprotein is moving through the blood. Here we're in a capillary, and here's our endothelial cell, which is near muscle cells or adipocytes, and it's covered in all of these ApoC2 proteins. These will interact with the lipoprotein lipase right there, which is off until it binds, it interacts with this. Now it's turned on, boom, these guys are now lunch meat. They're going to be taken up and swallowed and cut up and now pushed into the various tissue beds. So that's just how the lipoprotein lipase is working. So you eat a bunch of brownies, fat comes in, we have bile to emulsify the fat to increase the surface area so that our hepatic lipases can have access to it and cut it up. You can even see right here, I hope this is clear, like this is a glycerol and that's our one fatty acid. So this is a monoglycerol, not that that's that important. Goes into the intestinal cell, blah, 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 who cares, gets pushed out as a chylomicron. Chylomicrons they don't go into the blood though, they go into the lymphatic system and into a lacteal. And the lacteals, the lymphatic system, ultimately merges back up with the circulatory system around your neck at the subclavian vein. So that's where it's going to enter systemic circulation. That does mean though, we're pushing these nonpolar fats into the blood and they're not getting like checked and modified by the liver the first time through. So this is a first pass thing. It will eventually go to the liver, just it hits the circulation once before going to the liver. Let's follow it. All right, so here's our chylomicron again. we're just zooming in now, right? It's not it's not inflating. We're just zooming in now. So here's our chylomicron. All they have right now is ApoB48, which for our purposes doesn't do shit. ApoB48 is just the shorter version of ApoB100 and doesn't do anything that we really care about. I'm sure it's more complex. It plays a role in stability. Who cares? For us, it does nothing. All right, so HDL, just a nice, solid, good dude, real mensch, has an ApoE, ApoC2, and it's going to gift them, right? Here is our ApoC2, C for cleave. Here is our ApoE, E for exit. This thing is chock full of the brownie fat that usually all the butter is just stored in here as triglycerides. We want to give this to adipocytes and maybe other cells. Let's just say adipocytes for right now. The lipoprotein lipase is, again, we're in the peripheral tissue. This is an endothelial cell. This is inactive, though, until it interacts with the ApoC2. Now that it's active, that's me cutting all of the triglycerides and putting them into the adipocyte where we can get stored. This shrinks the size of the chylomicron. We now call it a chylomicron remnant. It doesn't need the ApoC2 anymore, right? The HDL says, give me that back. So it takes the ApoC2. We do have the ApoE. We're now going to use it. E for exit. We're exiting the bloodstream. We're going specifically into the liver. New event. We're now making a VLDL. The liver is taking a lot of triglycerides, a little bit of cholesterol, and it's packaging it up into a VLDL. Keep in mind that the VLDL, very low density, means it's a low density of proteins, which is just a ridiculous amount of lipids. Not as much as a chylomicron, but it was just the next most. So, chylomicron should be called very, 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 very low density lipoprotein, but we just call it a chylomicron. So this has a ton of lipids, a ton of triglycerides, a ton of cholesterol, and it has the ApoB100. It is ultimately going to use this. Technically, it won't use it. Recall that the VLDL becomes the IDL, which becomes the LDL, and the LDL is the one who's going to use the 100. But, so it needs it because it's ultimately going to transform to something that needs it. So ApoB100, again, so it can't really do anything now until nice dude HDL comes over, gives it a C2, and gives it an E. So here we have our VLDL, the lipoprotein lipase, interacts with the C2. Boom! All of the fats are going out, getting cleaved, going into the adipocyte. Gets a little bit smaller. We got an IDL, which is a VLDL remnant. There's less triglycerides. Because when I say we're cleaving the triglycerides. Keep in mind that there's triglycerides and cholesterol. We're cleaving triglycerides, less of those, still have the cholesterol. This IDL now, a bunch of different ways. You can trade, it can have hepatic lipase. I think just the main way to know, just to simplify it, is just, and it makes sense. It has this ApoE. Let's just say them almost always, and I think this is what they'll ask you, is that it just goes to the liver. It is taken up, somehow modified, who cares, and then it's spit right back out, right? This is not like the chylomicron going in and the VLDL. Those are separate events. This is like linked. It goes to the liver and immediately gets pushed back out. It is now called an LDL. The main difference is maybe it lost a little bit of triglycerides and it now lost this ApoE. This LDL is now going to go and be absorbed by some random cell and degraded and have, what does the LDL have? Almost all just cholesterol. The cholesterol is going to be used. Remember, cholesterol is good it's a fluidity buffer in the membrane. It can help make certain hormones. It's just useful for a lot of different things. And this is just a same thing. This is just a picture of the LDL binding with the receptors, being endocytosed, and then just being merged with a lysosome and just being absolutely degraded so that the cell can get the cholesterol. The whole idea is getting cholesterol there. It doesn't, again, just to really, take this home, it doesn't have ApoE. E is for... I guess I should be more specific. E is for exiting the bloodstream to the liver. This is exiting the bloodstream, but it's not going home. It's not going to the liver. I always thought of this as like, it's like a kamikaze mission. And in Pearl Harbor, I think they're like, oh no, they're just trying to make it dramatic. But at the end of the movie, they're like, spoiler, they're trying to they're going on a big attack mission, and they realize that they can't have enough bullets or something unless they get rid of half the gasoline. But that means they can only make it to the enemies and not back. So it's like a suicide mission. Kind of same thing here, is you're not going to go back home. You're not going back to the liver. You have a horrible death awaiting you. You're going to the peripheral tissue. You're not coming back. You don't have the ApoE, and you're ultimately going to be degraded. I also thought of Gattaca, which doesn't fit as well, but I just thought it was an awesome scene. You're not coming back. All right, more apolipoproteins. So now on HDL specifically. So HDL has a lot of proteins that is gifting to people, but it also has some of its own proteins that it uses for itself. Again, this is high density of proteins, meaning not a lot of lipids. Some, but not a lot. CETP is for trading. It trades with the other lipoproteins. I think all of them, VLDLs and IDLs, maybe not chylomicrons. And it trades. It's going to give them triglycerides in exchange for cholesterol. Excuse me. I think it's doing the opposite. It's giving cholesterol in exchange for triglycerides. Maybe fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what happens because I think all it has is cholesterol for the most part. I think that's all it has to trade. I could be wrong. Fact check me. A1 then, it's definitely for trading. A1 is going to bind to ABCA1, which is on various cells. We'll talk about that in a second. Actually, no, we'll talk about that now. It binds to ABCA1. ABC1 is an efflux transporter. So a cell has too much cholesterol for whatever reason, and it's saying, it's coughing, I can't, please get rid of this cholesterol. It's the ABCA1 is pushing the cholesterol out onto the HDL, which is binding to it. A1 also is going to activate something called LCAT. LCAT converts cholesterol, which is definitely nonpolar, but it's kind of polar, to a cholesterol ester, which is super nonpolar. And if things are nonpolar, they get buried deeper inside, right? Think of like a hydrohydrochloric. So it's going to get deeper into the lipoprotein. All right, let's go ahead and just, take a look at this. Probably the cell that has too much cholesterol is going to be something like a macrophage. We'll talk about that in a second. Too much cholesterol. Here's our HDL. It's just a little baby. It's pretty. It binds to the ABCA1, which is going to spit cholesterol out, which is interacting with the A1. Now A1 is going to activate LCAT. LCAT, what does LCAT do? LCAT is going to convert a cholesterol here, notice the OH group, to a cholesterol ester with just this. Which one of these is more polar? Definitely this one. If I had a substance, what's going to be on the outside interacting with water? More this one. This one is going to be deep buried into the core, and that's exactly what we see here, right? Free cholesterol is on the outside of the lipoprotein. The cholesterol ester is deep on the inside. Now this HDL can go ahead and, I had it right the second time. My correction was correct. So here's my HDL, and all it really has to trade is cholesterol. So it's going to give cholesterol to an IDL, and that kind of makes sense, right? The whole idea of IDL going to LDL is that we're getting more cholesterol, because that's what an LDL is. So there's a little bit of triglycerides left, and it's saying, give me all those. I'm going to give you cholesterol, and you know what? I'm taking this dang ApoE because you're not gonna need it because LDL/U is going to go on this suicide mission. It takes triglycerides. It can then go. It also does this with LDL, but I don't know. Ignore that one. It then goes to the liver, and it gives the liver a lot of these fats and maybe a little bit of cholesterol as well. Right? It's not like it does this ETP every time. So that's so it can do the trade, great. Now separately, it can go to the liver and it says, hey, I just scavenged from the blood vessels, from the cells, a lot of triglycerides, a lot of cholesterol. Here you go, do whatever you want with them. And one nice thing that we can do is we can convert this to bile and then excrete some of it. Okay, cool. Yeah, that was complicated, but so what is HDL is just going to suck up a lot of cholesterol from cells that don't want it anymore. So that means it's actually really good for atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is mostly due to cholesterol, not so much triglycerides, cholesterol deposition in the blood vessels. So HDL is like Kirby's sucking up all of this cholesterol and taking it to the liver where you can, liver's going to make the stuff, you poop it out. LDL, it would be the opposite. LDL is carrying cholesterol around and sometimes going to lose this cholesterol. It could be contributing to atherosclerosis. This is why we say HDL is the good, LDL is the bad. VLDL is not as high on our radar because, again, it's more triglycerides. More specifically, somehow LDL, took a wrong turn at Albuquerque. Here's the blood over here, right? Here's our plasma. It's going to move through the endothelial cell right here. It's going to move to the intima, so subendothelial layer. It is going to, it's going to get oxidized as things just do for whatever reason over time. That's bad. And the macrophage comes, monocyte is patrolling and it goes, hey, what the fuck are you doing in here? So it starts gobbling up all of the oxidized low-density lipoprotein particles. But you know what? There's too many of them. There's too many of them. It overdoes it. It's me at Thanksgiving. It's eating way more than it should. It's getting too stuffed, and then it dies. It dies. It becomes this foam cell. It's now permanently stuck there, and lots of bad things happen. One of them is that as it's dying, it sends out these help signals, which make the problem worse. This is a positive feedback because these help signals get more monocytes to come in. They think oh, I can eat like 17 hot dogs, no problem. They also eat too much oxidized lipoproteins. They swell, more foam cells. This is atherosclerosis. So this is the beginning steps. So more specifically now, or I guess that's the LDL component. Now the other side is that a macrophage, could be other cells, let's say macrophage, it's in an arterial wall. Hopefully we get to it before it's a foam cell. It's like, oh my God, there's too much cholesterol. So it's spitting this out with an ABCA1, which is binding to the ApoA1 of an HDL. So the HDL is now taking in a lot of this cholesterol. So this is also, a lot of this is part of the maturation process of the, I think it was like the evolution of a HDL particle. So, binds the ABCA1, sucks up that cholesterol. The ApoA1 is now going to activate LCAT. LCAT's job is to turn a cholesterol, which is kind of on the outside because it's a little bit polar, into a cholesterol ester, which is buried deep on the inside of the HDL. Of the HDL. The HDL now takes this to the liver, and boom, we make some bile, which we just need bile, or maybe we hope maybe we have too much cholesterol and we're going to lose some of this bile, or you could we can help deliver it to like the adrenal cortex or the testes because they definitely need cholesterol to make these non-polar cholesterol-based hormones like testosterone or progesterone or aldosterone, etc. Atherosclerosis. Atheros is the pasty fat. Sclerosis is the fibrous cap and the muscle. So here, this is the blood, and then we said that the in here is where we said the LDL particles are going, and then the macrophage says, hey, what are you doing? Gobbles it up, too much. Foam cell dies, recruits more, and it's just this awful thing. So this is the ather. This is all the fat. These are all the foam cells that ate too much of the cholesterol. And then to protect this, the body has muscle cells and fibroblasts start laying down this layer. So this is the sclerosis. This is the athero. All right, a little bit of a review. Chylomicron has a B48, which for our purposes does nothing. It is post-transcriptional editing. We get rid of the LDL receptor ligand. It gets the ApoC2 and the E from the nice HDL. That's because we want to cleave these triglycerides and we want it to be taken up by the liver. It's going to go through the lymphatic system at the neck, at the thoracic duct. It merges with the subclavian vein, so it's going to have a first-pass metabolism. And it's just giving fats, like we said, to tissues. VLDL has the 100, meaning it has the receptor ligand. That's because the VLDL might use it a little bit. Some of the VLDLs actually might be taken up. But I think how we should think of it is VLDL becomes IDL becomes LDL, and the LDL is the one that needs this LDL receptor ligand, literally named for the thing that needs an LDL receptor. Again, we're getting nice gifts, the C2 and the E from the HDL. C2 because we have a lot of triglycerides. Let's cleave them. ApoE because IDL often goes to the liver, it's reabsorbed. So the E exiting to the liver, we need that. And then becomes IDL, and we just said there's a couple different ways, mainly just going to the liver with the help of this ApoE to become an LDL. LDL is reborn from the ashes of the IDL, which is just a VLDL remnant. It's mostly just cholesterol. That's all. ApoB 100, meaning it has the LDL receptor ligand because it's the LDL. Its job is to go on this suicide mission where it says, I'm not coming home, boys. And it gets absorbed into, probably like the adrenal cortex, where it's then broken down in a lysosome. And we now have cholesterol that we can make cortisone and aldosterone from. We don't need ApoC2. ApoC2 is for activating lipoprotein lipase, which makes triglycerides. But we just said it's mostly cholesterol, so that's not needed. So it make sense, right? Pure memorization is great, and there's a lot of memorizing. Some of this stuff is random as shit, but it makes it so much easier if you try to follow the story. HDL, more stories. Liver and intestine makes this. It is going to, we'll get into this. It's going to scavenge cholesterol. ABCA1 pumps this out from like a foam cell or whatever, macrophage, and gives it to the HDL. A1 also is going to activate LCAT, which is going to turn cholesterol into a cholesterol ester. It's packaged on the center of the HDL, and somehow this is important for its spiritual journey evolution to a mature HDL. CETP is for trading. All it has is cholesterol or cholesterol esters, so it's going to give them in exchange for triglycerides. And this is one of the ways that an IDL can become an LDL. But again, really, I wouldn't focus too much on like the complex journey of IDL to LDL. I probably looked this up too much. I don't think you need to know that much for the NBME on that one particular point. It's going to take some of these leftover stuff to the liver. The liver can do whatever it wants with it. One of the things might be nice is turn it to bile and excrete it. If we have too much, right? We definitely need some. It is also playing a role at donating C2 and ApoE to various lipoproteins for cleaving and for exiting to the liver. We think of it as H for healthy. It's this nice hero because it scavenges, is going to get rid of the cholesterol from those macrophages of those the foam cells, so I don't have atherosclerosis. It's going to take this cholesterol and maybe help us turn it into poopy so that we can get it out of the body. That's also good, right? It's taking to the liver and saying, hey, you're smart. Like, can you deal with all of this stuff? It's probably not good inside of the blood vessel. And I don't want my chylomicrons and my VLDLs so fat's bad, but give or take, too much fat's bad, definitely. And having a lot of adipocytes is bad, but the worst thing about fat is if it's in the blood too much and if the cholesterol is in the blood too much. So it would be really bad if my chylomicrons and my VLDLs didn't have C2. Because if you can't cleave, then a VLDL stays a VLDL and a chylomicron stays a chylomicron, and then they're going to stay in your blood forever. And you know what? Eventually those lipids are going to leak out and they're going to get where they don't need to be. And that's going to cause hyperlipidemia. Too much lipids, emia in the blood. Too much lipids in the blood, that's bad. That's atherosclerosis. Cholesterol is worse than triglycerides, but they're both still bad. So the C2, we need it. Otherwise, we have too much of those two lipoproteins I just mentioned in the blood. Same thing with ApoE, right? Just because you have C2 activated lipoprotein lipase, yeah, you're going to lose some triglycerides. If you don't lose all of them, you still have some left. So if I didn't have ApoE, sure, I'd have a chylomicron remnant, I'd have a VLDL remnant, an IDL, but they just sit in the blood for a long time, and that'd be bad. So for these three reasons, and maybe this one's actually a little, kind of befuddles me, not important. For these three reasons, maybe four, we can think of HDL as the H for healthy or H for hero. That just came to me. Normal values, HDL around 50, LDL around 120. Combined, we'd want it less than 200. But again, HDL is the good one, LDL is the bad one. Triglycerides, 120. Now there's a couple of, sometimes we call these beta, but I would just think of this as primary hyperlipidemia. So these are genetic diseases that might be, primary means genetic. We'll see secondary in a second. You're just eating too many brownies, but genetic diseases lead to too much lipoproteins in the blood. So there's this nice saying, 1 LP, 2 LD. B adds V, 3 is E, 4 gets more. I would know that 4 and 2B are the most common. So if you get questions, they're honestly probably on these because these are just tiny and not that important. So, if you don't have a lot of time, just memorize what 2B and 4 do. All right, this is really helpful, right? 1 LP, what are we talking about? LP as in LPL, lipoprotein lipase. You have issues with lipoprotein lipase or the activation of lipoprotein lipase via ApoC2, this is what happens. You're going to accumulate too many chylomicrons. At first, I thought it might be you should also accumulate too many VLDLs, but technically VLDL does have the B100, so it theoretically could be taken up by an LDL receptor. So I guess you'd see a big rise in chylomicrons, small rise in VLDLs, but that's just like the truth and like in the logic of it. But just memorize that as chylomicrons here. And again, that should make sense, though. They cannot be broken down, and so they're not going to become chylomicron remnants, so they just hang around. If you have too much lipids in the blood, too much fats can just deposit in the skin and give you, xanthoma. So you'll get a xanthoma, specifically in the skin in this case. Spoiled it. 2 LD, what are we talking about? Well, this one's easy. LD as in LDL. So this is where you have... LDL is sticking around because it doesn't have the LDL receptor on peripheral tissues is screwed up, or the ApoB100 binding domain is specifically screwed up. And again, this would only affect LDLs because, yeah, sure, a VLDL and an IDL also have the B100, but the B100, the LDL binding portion is really for the LDL. And you get xanthomas as it makes sense for all of these, but I would just know that they're tendinous, right? So they'll tell you in a vignette where it is, and they'll tell you the blood levels too. Even if you didn't memorize, what xanthoma goes where, you should still be able to figure it out. But this is like an extra useful pro tip if you know where they are. B adds V. So we have two types. We have 2A and 2B. B adds V, so LDL and VLDL. I'm actually not sure exactly like the 2A makes sense. I'm not actually sure the proteins that cause the 2B. Note that for 2A and 2B, and 2B is the more common one. You can potentially have a homozygous and a heterozygous, and the homozygous phenotype, homozygous mutant would be worse. 3 is E. So here we're talking about ApoE. What would happen if ApoE is not working? E for exiting to the liver. I am going to accumulate chylomicron remnants. I'm going to accumulate IDL. Exactly what we just said. Chylomicron remnants and the IDLs are going to accumulate, and you get Palmer xanthoma. And then 4 gets more. We're just making more VLDL. And if you're making more VLDL, you might get a little bit more IDLs and LDLs as well, because, of course, they're downstream of that. Secondary, this is probably more common, right? What sucks about, I'm going to vent for a second about the whole preclinical, is it takes so much more cognitive effort and time to memorize all of this, but it's just like super rare. Well, this is the way more important thing you're going to see in the clinic. And, and I think even like if we spend so much time looking at this, we might think this is more important, but this is more important. But again, you're going to see both. There's the short-term goal, do well in your MBME, and the long-term goal, be a good doctor. So short-term, you need to know both. Long-term, this one's more important, I think. Hypothyroid, I always, thyroid helps, does a bunch of things, but it can help increase your metabolic activity. If you're decreasing your metabolic activity, you're probably not burning your fat. You're going to accumulate fat, and it's not needed as much. I'm sure it's more complicated, but that's how I thought of the link there. You just eat too many brownies, too much fried chicken. Too much alcohol. Remember earlier we said that you oxidize ethanol to acetaldehyde, that generates an NADH. Acetaldehyde to acetate, that generates another NADH. You have this NADH overload. It makes your body think that there's we're great, we have so much energy, look at all of this NADH, and it might prevent OAA from forming. And so if you don't have OAA, you don't have acetyl-CoA combined with anything. So what does acetyl-CoA do? Well, yeah, it's going to give you ketone breath and stuff, but it's also going to now generate fats. And so you get, secondary hyperlipidemia. Nephrotic syndrome, we need albumin to maintain osmotic gradients for capillary exchange. You're peeing out all of your albumin here. So your body compensates by generating some VLDL. It's just a warm body. So back in Gen Chem, remember colligative properties. The idea is that it doesn't matter, the identity of the solute doesn't matter, but it's how much we have of them. And so in other words, so much proteins in your blood creates this osmotic pole, and that's mainly albumin. And so VLDL just more protein, doesn't matter which one, will create an osmotic gradient. So we make more VLDL to compensate. Good news for the osmotic gradient, but bad news for having too much triglycerides in our blood, and cholesterol, because that's also there. Diabetes, type 1 or 2. So insulin is necessary or helpful for an adipocyte to take lipids out of the blood to store them. And so if that doesn't work, we're going to have more lipids in the blood. Additionally, insulin is going to help cells absorb glucose. And if cells aren't absorbing glucose, well, they still have energy demand. So for whatever reason, they're hey, no glucose is coming in. Can you bring some fats over? So, fatty acid mobilization, fatty acids in the back of albumin, or we're going to have VLDLs go over. And in either case, you're just going to have more fats in the blood. And then biliary obstruction or cirrhosis, a screwed up liver, you cannot properly generate bile and excrete it in the stool. So you're going to have hypercholesterolemia here as well. A bunch of different drugs to bring down our levels. Again, we're mainly concerned not with being less fat or having less adipocytes, but we're talking about mainly having less fats in the blood. We already talked about this one. Cholestyramine binds bile acids. It sequesters them. I forget the number, but 5%, 20%, some percent is reabsorbed. Here we're preventing the reabsorption. This is going to bind to them, and we're going to poop more of it out. Ezetimibe, this is just going to go ahead and line the intestines so that we don't absorb cholesterol in the first place. So this is going to lead to floaters, right? We have smelly fat, lipid-laden poop, and it's just going to float. It's going to be like whitish and kind of yellowish clear. Statins, this is the big one, inhibits MGA-CoA reductase. Not to be confused with earlier, we said MGA-CoA synthase, which is going to play a role in ketogenesis. This is reductase, and this is the rate-limiting step for cholesterol synthesis, so this is going to lower LDL levels. Fibrates, somehow they interact with this transcription factor, PPAR-alpha, increase the amount of HDL we have. They're also going to somehow enhance the activity of lipoprotein lipase so that we're cleaving the fats from the lipoprotein particles in the blood, and then they're absorbed into the fats or the muscles or whatever. And niacin B3 inhibits lipolysis. Okay, well, that means like my fat's going to stay in my adipocyte, right? No fatty acid mobilization or less. And so that just means I'm going to have less fats in the blood if more of it is stored in the adipocytes. And TZD, this sensitizes you to insulin. And we just saw a second ago that a secondary hyperlipidemia is caused by diabetes and insulin issues. So this is kind of the opposite. This is a medication for diabetes. More fatty acid uptake to adipocytes and muscles, less in the blood. Also sensitizing to insulin, I'm going to take up more sugar from the blood, which means that I don't actually need the beta oxidation and the fat delivery for energy because the glucose is going to work fine. Then pancreatic lipase inhibitors, bile emulsifies and the lipase breaks down. And so if we're not breaking down, it's harder to absorb and you're just going to poop out all your fat. You get more floaters. Okay, I think this next section is really low yield, but we'll talk about it anyways. We're talking about breaking down proteins. A couple different ways proteins can get broken down, or really just two main ways. We have the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, and this is probably for like short-lived proteins. So a lot of proteins are going to be cyclical, right? I mean, one example could be like circadian rhythm proteins. PER1 and PER2. They're in a 24-hour cycle. They're going to come, they're generated, and then we need them to be degraded. Or even something like insulin, right? You produce insulin after a meal, and then eventually you don't want your insulin. You need to be degraded. So things are constantly degraded. So this is normal. This is a pathway. But a protein that's misfolded as well, like that's just bad, shitty protein. We want to degrade that too. But if proteins start to aggregate, like, I don't know, you get a tau bundle in like Alzheimer's or something, or just anytime they're aggregating, that's bad. Or it actually could not just be a protein, but like an entire organelle. Just push it into a lysosome. You have a vesicle with the bad stuff that you don't want. You fuse it with a lysosome, and then it's going to be, autophagy, or I would just think of this as lysosomal breakdown. We can also break down proteins as well. So, okay, a couple of reasons we can break down proteins. We just need energy, right? We said that this is maybe the last thing because your proteins are really important, and like you don't want to break down all your muscle and it just the proteins within your cells because it costs a lot of energy and they have jobs to do. But if you really need it in a pinch, yeah, that's useful. If proteins are oxidized or misfolded or somehow damaged, let's get rid of them. Regulatory proteins systematically need to be degraded, and we also just mentioned protein aggregates. So the lysosomal pathway, lysosome, giant vesicle filled with acid, filled with a bunch of hydrolytic enzymes, which just break down shit, kind of like a little stomach within the cell. Turns out there's something called the KFERQ. So we said that you do not want to break down proteins typically because they're important and they're hard to make. So that's like the last resort to break down proteins. But we can be even more nuanced. So, okay, I got to start breaking down proteins. We can make it so that you are only breaking down like unimportant proteins. Or proteins that aren't essential for like cell survival. And these proteins often will have a KFERQ, penta amino acid sequence. And so we can selectively degrade these in the liver and then push them out to fuel, gluconeogenesis and fuel the rest of the body. And so when we're breaking things down though, we've got, it could be a whole organelle, but again, we're mainly talking about proteins, bunch of protein aggregates, push them into a vesicle, and then just push them, merge them with the lysosome, and there you go. Ubiquitin, a little bit more to talk about. Lysine K can be linked to ubiquitin, and it actually can do a lot of different things. Bunch of different processes. The main one that we're going to be talking about, though, or really the main one in general, is just it's going to mediate proteolysis in a proteasome. It's often the 48th position on a protein. We said regulatory proteins, damaged proteins, blah, 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 blah. Here's our protein. Here's our ubiquitin. Ubiquitin itself is also a protein. And then we put on a ubiquitin to the lysine and the next ubiquitin on that ubiquitin. You just create a long ubiquitin tail. This ubiquitin is going to interact with the proteasome, and the proteasome is like a wood chipper, and it's just going to, like, eat up the protein and spit out the amino acids. Same reason that a transcription factor has a higher affinity. Like, we transcribe from euchromatin, not heterochromatin. One of the reasons that a transcription factor can more easily bind to accessible DNA, which is open in euchromatin and a little bit more dense and closed off in heterochromatin. Same thing here. A disordered region, here might be like an alpha helix, and here's a disordered region, and then like here's a beta sheet or something, right? So if I'm a ubiquitin, it's probably easier to go on to the disordered region right here. And so it's easier to put more ubiquitin, and so the long disordered segments are going to have a very short half-life. They're going to go quickly, and then vice versa. If you have a short disordered segment, it's harder to find like a right spot for the ubiquitin to attach to the lysine. Now, specifically, we're going to have three enzymes that are mediating the transfer of a ubiquitin to a protein. And again, ubiquitin is like a kick me sign on a protein. It's a protein that we don't want anymore. So, okay, ubiquitin is a protein. I'm talking about the proteins that we want to destroy. The ubiquitin is the kick me sign for the protein we want to destroy. And if you have enough of them, you're going to get kicked. You're going to send over the proteasome and you get destroyed. E1 is going to just literally grab the ubiquitin. Great. What does E2 do? It just pushes out E1. I don't even know why. This is all simple. Actually, we'll kind of talk about why, but it just seems weird for now. It just swaps with the E1. Now it has the ubiquitin. What does E3 do? Well, notice E3 is kind of the middleman. It's saying, hey, here E2, here's substrate, meaning protein we want to destroy. Why don't you guys meet up? And it's going to transfer the ubiquitin over to the substrate. And that's just the first one onto the lysine. You can see the lysine right there. But then we're going to put the other ones on. Ubiquitin itself is a protein, right? So then we're going to ubiquitinate the ubiquitin. My reasoning for this is that E1 just grabs ATP, but often things are, done in clusters. So this is probably a bad example because you probably, just have constitutive expression of glycolytic enzyme. But let's just say a cell needed to do glycolysis once a day for an hour. Okay, so if that was the case, I need all of my proteins for 1 hour, and I need a lot of proteins, right? There's a lot of enzymes that play a role in glycolysis. So E2 is going to be related to all glycolysis-related proteins. This E2, we have a different E2 for this and a different E2 for this. So this is E2A, this is E2B, E2C, E2D, right? There are going to be many different types of E2. And these E2 are going to, then go to even more specific enzymes, E3, E4, E5 for various, hexokinase, pyruvate kinase, et cetera, over here. You're also, this is increasing the regulatory specificity. There's also going to be an amplification effect. I'm not 100% sure on this, but you know what? This isn't even going to be on your test. So if this doesn't make a lot of sense, I wouldn't worry about it. Again, E1, E2 swaps, and then E3 meets up in the middle with E2 and the actual protein we want to destroy and says, hey, let's just put this ubiquitin on the protein, the substrate that we want to destroy in the lysine. And then we just attach those on those, and then we put it in a proteasome, and it's just going to destroy the thing. It requires a lot of ATP, though, to destroy things. I guess you also have a little ATP when you're putting it on, but a lot of ATP when you're destroying the protein and putting it in the wood chipper. So myelination is pretty much the same thing. You're gonna take the sumo group and you're gonna put it onto this first protein, and then you're gonna put it onto this second protein, and then the third protein is gonna facilitate the interaction between this E2 and the target, and then we're gonna put it onto the target. Obviously, amino acids go into proteins, but there's also a lot of interesting derivatives from amino acids. So this next section, we're going to just talk about some fun facts about amino acids and some of their downstream products. Private Tim Hall, this is for the 10 amino acids that you must get from the diet. Arginine is technically essential when you're a kid. I always thought of 9 as being like a kid. Methionine might be essential. We need to get that from our diet. But technically, methionine can make cysteine. So cysteine is not essential. If you have enough methionine, you're good on cysteine. But it's like pseudo-essential, because if you don't have methionine, then the cysteine goes away. Same thing with phenylalanine and tyrosine. Phenylalanine makes tyrosine, so we can also consider tyrosine to be pseudo-essential. Kwashiorkor is a term where um, you don't have enough protein in your diet. So you might be getting enough calories, but you're just eating potato chips all day, or you're in a developing country and you just have an all rice diet. I thought of the fact that some people might wash their rice, and so you're eating an all rice diet. So good on calories, but not good on protein. If you do not have enough protein, you cannot make albumin. And as I mentioned earlier, albumin is important to maintain osmotic gradients. What that means is, here's my blood moving here. Now, it's more complicated than this, but the blood's going here, and it's occasionally pushing fluid out. Ideally, more fluid is going out than is coming in. But you need the albumin in the blood. You need all of this protein and this colligative property, protein in the blood, to like so that you don't push out too much blood. But if we don't, if all of this goes away because we just are eating all rice, now we don't have as much of an osmotic pull in our blood, and we're going to push out even more than we normally would. It's going to lead to edema. This is the main thing, the edema, and you can see that all over the body, and especially a protuberant belly, you're going to have edema there. Marasmus is just starvation, just no protein, no calories, sad. Some of the amino acid facts we talk about. Phenyl, kind of an overview. Phenylalanine becomes tyrosine. Tyrosine makes a bunch of stuff downstream from that. Catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, these neurotransmitters. Dopa leads to L-dopa. It's its own thing. L-dopa makes dopamine, but it also makes something called melanin. I always remember that because the substantia nigra, something in the brain and the basal ganglia, and that makes a lot of dopamine. That's its job. But it's called substantia nigra, and that means black substance. And that's because the dopa becomes dopamine, but it also becomes melanin. Tyrosine also makes thyroxine. The names kind of sound similar. I buy it. Tryptophan, anything that ends in nin is going to be made from tryptophan. Niacin, so it's a B3, and then serotonin, melatonin. I think I mentioned that people say after Thanksgiving that you eat a bunch of turkey and it makes you sleepy. And some people, if you do like ecstasy or something, people would take turkey similarly, and the idea is that it would restore the serotonin. Both of those are probably not true, but there's fun ways to remember it. Cysteine can lead to cystinuria. Glycine can make heme. Histidine can make histamine. Arginine can make creatinine, which helps for storing energy in the muscles. Can also make urea. Can also help make nitric oxide, which among other things is a vasodilator. Branched amino acids. If you have a deficiency in the enzyme that breaks these down, you have a disease called maple syrup urine disease. Glutamate, well, that just itself is an excitatory neurotransmitter, but it can also make inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA. Also glutathione to help fight, and reduce reactive oxygen species, GLUT and glutamate. Makes sense. Start with phenylalanine. All right, this is a lot, but I think it's really important to know, so we're going to go through it, completely. Phenylalanine makes tyrosine. Tyrosine makes dopa. Dopa, as we said, can become melanin. And remember, substantia nigra makes dopamine, but it also makes melanin, which is why it's dark. Dopamine becomes norepinephrine. Norepinephrine becomes epinephrine by having a methyl group added. And I always just remember that this is norepinephrine, like no R. And you know what? I do not see an R there. But then we've used one of our little SAM molecules that we talked about earlier and we'll talk about again later, to methylate this. So this is no R, and by contrast, this one must have the R. It must have the methyl group on it. There's a lot of cofactors we need, but it's actually kind of nice. They're in alphabetical order: B, 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 C, S. And they're also in numerical order, right? We got a tiebreaker right here. It's the 4s before the 6. If we have a missing phenylalanine hydroxylase, our first enzyme, you develop phenylketonuria, PKU. If you do not have tyrosinase to turn your dopamine, actually, I think it's supposed to be dopa into melanin. All right, as we speak, all right, we got dead air. Melanin, dopa, I'm Googling it. I'm pretty sure, I think I made this last year. Dopa becomes melanin. Yeah, I'm a friggin' idiot, or I was. Or I'm still an idiot, but Yeah, L-DOPA becomes, so DOPA becomes melanin. Nice try, past me. Tyrosine can turn into homogentistic acid, which can be broken down to who cares via this enzyme homogentistic oxidase. And if that doesn't work, you have something called alkaptonuria. And again, no R. If you want to break down the catecholamines, especially norepinephrine and epinephrine, COMT and MAO. MAO is especially important, monoamine oxidase. And it breaks it down to metanephrine and vanilla mandelic acid. And sometimes this is going to be useful for certain, if you have pheochromocytosis, you have a cancer of your adrenal medulla, you might be making way too much of this and having severe hypertension. So we might look for your urine to see like metanephrine or vanilla mandelic acid, which is, as the name implies, similar to the vanilla that we put in our ice cream. So MAO is more common. There's a more commonly, you should know it because there's an antidepressant, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which could, as a side effect, cause hypertension because we have norepinephrine and epinephrine and they cannot be broken down and they are going to vasoconstrict, raise our blood pressure. Additionally, there's something called tyramine, which somehow stimulates norepinephrine release and it also acts as a competitive inhibitor from monoamine oxidase so that we can't break it down. So both of these, monoamine oxidase and tyramine, should theoretically lead to a little bit of hypertension. If you put them together, you can have like extra hypertension. Phenylketonuria, phenylalanine hydroxylase deficient, you technically could have a deficiency of the BH4 cofactor. And so, one, you can't make tyrosine. So we said tyrosine was pseudo-essential. So that's not super hard. Just eat a bunch of food with tyrosine, right? So that can be fixed. The bigger problem is that phenylalanine, if it can't go forward, goes to the side reaction, makes phenylpyruvate, which is toxic. So potentially you'd have a neurotransmitter imbalance because we can't make all of the catecholamines. And it might be more complicated. It might be that just for whatever reason, the tyrosine that you get from your diet doesn't somehow get to where it needs to go to make these catecholamines. I'm kind of BSing, I'm not really sure, but theoretically you would have a neurotransmitter imbalance. It makes sense at the very least, right? You can't make as much tyrosine, so you can't make these catecholamines that are necessary. So mental retardation and intellectual disability would occur. It's weird. They say there's a mouse-like odor to the urine and the sweat. So it's musty. And tyrosine, we know, makes DOPA, which now we know for sure makes melanin, and melanin makes you dark. And so if you don't have this, you might, blondish hair, bluish eyes, and pale skin. So you would obviously want to not have phenylalanine or as much. Obviously you need some, but less, so that you can have less of this toxic phenylpyruvate. Additionally, as we said, you want to supplement tyrosine and stay away from aspartame because that just contains phenylalanine. And yeah, if you treat it well, I think they can actually, is mostly something we can take care of and sort of like rescue the phenotype. We mentioned you can have a deficiency there or deficiency there. Alkaptonuria, so homogentistic acid. So phenylalanine becomes tyrosine. Tyrosine normally goes this way, but sometimes it goes this way for whatever reason. And that is broken down here. Oopsie, we don't have that, so we're going to get this thing. So these levels are going to build up, and they collect in your skin, they collect in your cartilage. And this happens over time. People might be mostly asymptomatic until they're in like early middle age. People will develop osteoarthritis. As it progresses, you might get bluish skin, and we might see it in the urine. So if somebody had this in the urinated, urine looks normal color, but then over time there's oxygenation of the homogentistic acid, which accumulates in the urine, and then it turns darkish blue. Sometimes it's diagnosed, as I said, people don't know. Maybe you're like doing a sport, you're skiing, you tear your MCL, and they want to do surgery when you're 28, and they open you up. And they look at your kneecap cartilage and they see, this is the ear, but they see a lot of blue in the kneecap. That might be the first. As it gets worse, it might be visible from the outside, but you theoretically could catch it in surgery a little bit earlier. Albinism, boom, that doesn't work. So just note that we have the melanocytes, we have enough of them, they're fine. It's the melanin production that's just not working. Maple syrup disease, so we said that there's a weird way to break down the branched amino acids. We need this enzyme, and you know what? If it doesn't work, you don't have them, and you're going to excrete some of this in the urine. And I don't know who came up with this. I just, what a weirdo. There's a burnt sugar, sweet smelling diaper smell. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but that's just like a funny, very specific way to describe something. Elevated plasma levels, I think theoretically they can make their way to the urine. Failure to thrive, babies' stunted growth and development. And just, you could have very specific formulas given to babies where there's just no branched amino acids. The note as well, and we'll talk about this later, alpha ketoglutarate can grab onto an ammonium and become glutamate. So glutamate can hold one ammonium. Glutamine is just there to hold on to it. And we have glutamine to hold on to another one. Now you might think, wait a second, don't all amino acids just have that? Yes, but it's going to come back later. I would just think of a glutamate as storing the one and glutamine as storing the two. It'll be helpful. Cystinuria. So here we're looking at nephron and the kidneys, and we're secreting and reabsorbing and blah blah blah, lots of stuff. Notice right over here where it's very vague. We're just reabsorbing nutrients. A lot of the nutrients are amino acids. One of those amino acids might be cysteine. For whatever reason, you have a defect with the transporter, which is reabsorbing cysteine, you're going to have too much of it. And if you have too much cysteine, we know that cysteine forms disulfide bonds. When their disulfide bonds are there, we call it cysteine. We have normal amount of cysteine in our body, but we're not reabsorbing like we should. So there's too much. It starts to bond to each other. Now we have too much cysteine. The cysteine starts to accumulate, and it precipitates, and it forms these little stones. And so these is one of many types of kidney stones, and this is cystinuria. Plants and bacteria, lots of stuff, not animals, can take PABA and pteridine, and they can turn it into THF. Now, I don't really think you need to know this whole pathway, but I would know that it's not us that's making this. And the tetrahydrofolate is really useful to make DNA and methionine and methylating things and all of this stuff. Now, something eats the plants, and then something eats that thing, and then there's the food chain, and then we eat that thing. So either we're eating the plants, we're eating the thing that's eating the plants, we're eating the thing that eats the thing that's eating the plants. This folate is then going to make its way to us. And folate is not active until dihydrofolate reductase, which works twice in a row, turns it into dihydrofolate, then tetrahydrofolate. We're then going to slap a methyl group on it to make it 5,10 methylene tetrahydrofolate, and blah, blah, blah. So we've seen the cycle. We're going to talk more about this. The DNA synthesis right here, uracilthymine, and then here's the methionine. The methionine needs to be generated via a well, it's not that it needs to be, but homocysteine can be turned into methionine. You could also, of course, get it from the diet. So we can methylate via the SAM proteins, right? You need to methylate DNA, cytosines and histones and whatnot, and ethanolamine needs to turn into choline. Lots of things we need to methylate, so that's important. The DNA synthesis part is the 5,10. So 5,10 methylene is good for the uracilthymine. 5-methyl, if you see it, is good for the conversion of homocysteine to methionine. And that's tricky, so let's go through it again, like step by step. Here's homocysteine. Homocysteine, this is what it looks like. Notice it looks a lot like methionine, except if you memorize what methionine looks like, except that there's a methyl group missing. And if you don't remember, we're going to see it in a second. So here's our homocysteine. Here's our 5. Remember, because where did the 5,10 go? 5,10 went over to the uracilthymine. So here's a 5-methyl whatever. And boom, we're just going to swap. The homocysteine grabs the methyl from the THF. Now it's just normal THF with no methyl. Why? Because the methyl is now on the methionine. We can see it right there. Okay, what's going to happen next? Boom, and adenosine is coming in. For me, it doesn't do shit. Know that it happens, but it doesn't really add anything. Here is our adenosine, and here is your methionine. Again, methionine just has this, and we see our methyl group sitting right there. S is just to, designate the enantiomer. This is because it's an adenosine with a methionine on it, right? What's going to happen now? We're going to methylate something. We're going to methylate a histone tail, or a cytosine, or an ethanolamine, or who knows. And if we methylate it, we're going to lose that methyl group. And so now it's S, just the enantiomer, A, adenosine still there, H, homocysteine. Well, remember, homocysteine was just the, methionine without that methyl group on the end of the sulfur. So SAH should make sense. You know what we can do then? Just get rid of the dang adenosine, and you're back where you started. You're back at homocysteine. Now, homocysteine can also, we can just continue the cycle. Homocysteine can also generate, as the name implies, cysteine. And these look pretty similar as well, right? We've got this amino acid with a sulfur group on it, just one carbon shorter. So we can make cysteine this way as well. So homocysteine can build up and cause a syndrome called homocystinuria. Homocysteine is going to be in the urine, but it causes a lot of bad things as well. How do you get this? B9 deficiency, B12 deficiency, B6 deficiency. You can't go any of those ways. Similarly, methionine synthase deficiency, cystathionine synthase deficiency as well. This causes an intellectual disability, dislocation of the eye lens. So this is so esoteric, but because eye lens dislocations are already rare on top of the fact that you don't see a lot of people with homocystinuria and Marfan's, but happens commonly in both of these, and they want you to differentiate. So here the lens is going to go down and in, right? We're talking about your eyeball, the lens of your eye. And then Marfan's is going to go upwards and, superior and lateral a little bit. It binds to endothelial cells and promotes like the release of pro-inflammatory molecules. So this can lead to vascular disease. People can get things like aneurysms, osteoporosis, and Marfan. So it's kind of like double, like, the lens dislocation is like Marfan's, but also Marfanoid habitus just means like that the body is, Marfanoid is a very, Marfan's disease is a very specific body type. You have this arched foot, right? Some people's foot goes like that. Some people's foot is a little bit more arched, and then their foot's like way too arched. Pes excavatum is a sunken chest. Carinatum, your chest goes out. So your chest bone, like your sternum, is going to push out or push in. And they're going to be very tall and thin with long limbs. We talked about this ad nauseum. You need this to make thymine. This is especially important for hematopoietic stem cells, which is why we develop a megaloblastic anemia with both of these, which we'll get to right now, in fact. So, yeah. So let's start with, so here's folic acid, folate, B9, very important in pregnancy. You get terrible birth defects if they don't have enough folate, so people take pills sometimes. And that's kind of just because there's a lot of cell division, so you need a lot of growth. There's a couple weeks worth of storage in folate. You theoretically wouldn't have any uracildothymine, so the DNA, the uracildothymine DNA is not going to, right? If we don't have this, we can't go to do this, right? How can we have low levels? Just naturally that you need a lot during pregnancy, but a lot of something like methotrexate could. Methotrexate is a competitive inhibitor, and it's if you have a severe autoimmune condition, we would give you this. Again, affects the hematopoietic lineage, so that makes sense. If you have cancer, we want to affect cells that are dividing too much. Cancer is dividing too much, so we're going to want to inhibit the folate acid, so the cancer cells can't make thymine, they can't divide as much. And if we just said pregnancy, you need a lot of folate. So what's the opposite of pregnancy? Well, maybe that's a hard thing to add. Abortion. If there's an ectopic pregnancy and we just want to terminate it, we could go, we might administer methotrexate, and it just completely gets rid of any development of THF. And so that also can just really just kill the baby. If we go on the other side, we have cobalamin, B12. B12 is in meat. So vegans might have to supplement with pills. Now there's years of storage, so you'd have to be a good vegan for years. I don't know if there's anybody who would hold this as like a point of honor, right? It's like I'm a very good vegan, and how is the proof is like I have some B12 deficiency, and you're a vegan, but you have a normal amount of B12. You're probably sneaking like pork chops when nobody's looking. So you theoretically might have a little bit of DNA synthesis because, again, the issue is you don't have B12, but you have folate. So you can go ahead and you could do a little bit of this. It might be hard to regenerate, though. I do think there's an alternative pathway. It might be a bit slower. You should theoretically build up a little bit of 5-methyl, right? Because oh God, it's so ugly here. But again, we're doing this. But you still might make a little bit of 5-methyl, but you don't have any B12 to make methionine and regenerate the THF. So these are just going to accumulate, and that might damage, myelin and whatnot, which is why you get something called subacute combined degeneration, cortical spinal tract, dorsal column medial lemniscus, spinocerebellar. You know what? You shouldn't know any of that though. Ignore those specific tracks. That's not important. Know that you're going to get some neuro issues because you have issues, problems with your myelin. Pernicious anemia. You have an autoimmune condition. It screws up your parietal cells. You can't make intrinsic factor. You need intrinsic factor to bind to B12 for it to absorb into your intestines. So you can have, that's one way. Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. Again, you screwed up your intestines. You got an autoimmune thing. Damage. You're going to have a hard time reabsorbing thing. Iatrogenic. You had a surgery. Maybe you had a gastric bypass. You, in your intestines, you cannot have, or you might have a difficulty absorbing lots of things, one of them being B12. Remember that B12 also plays a role in odd chain fatty acid breakdown. We make propionyl, and then that's propane is 3, and then malonyl is 3, and methylmalonyl is 4. So we make methylmalonic acid, and then that can be isomerized to succinyl-CoA. But that last step that I just said, that requires B12. So if you don't have B12, you cannot do that. Methylmalonic acid is going to go up. Now, both of these are going to cause megaloblastic anemia because we're not doing as much, thymine production as we need. Hematopoietic cells divide a lot, hits them extra hard. So the delayed nuclear maturation, large red blood cells, hypersegmented neutrophils. So that, again, the nucleus is going to be screwed up. So it all kind of makes sense there a bit. And the, anemia, not enough red blood cells, but just general pancytopenia, maybe not enough platelets, maybe not enough, white blood cells, and the homocysteine levels are going to be up. Because if I don't have this and I don't have this is just going to stay put and just accumulate. We're going to have more of it. Very important to tell these apart. So earlier we talked about breaking down proteins. You might do it because they're damaged, they're aggregating, they're just regulatory or just as a regulatory thing, like they've served their purpose and we want them out. But a lot of times just we need energy. So in general, maybe like 10% of our energy comes from just, breaking down amino acids. Now, that's going to be severely ramped up, right? It's significant, but it's not significant. You're going to break down a lot more if you've been starving for longer. And again, selectively with the KFERQ penta sequence, some proteins and some amino acids more than others. But so there's two different pathways. We break down a protein, we get a bunch of amino acids. We then need to break these down to either make ketones, so we have a ketogenic path, or to make glucose, so we have a glucogenic path. Notice that the Krebs cycle is involved here. So with the Krebs cycle, let's say that we have a fixed amount of Krebs intermediate. Maybe just one. Maybe there's just one oxaloacetate. And every time an acetyl-CoA combines, and that goes through. But there's a fixed pool. So imagine what happens if we have this, or this, or this, or this. I am now adding one to the pool. I have one extra alpha-ketoglutarate, or this, or this, or this. And so you know what? We have one extra one. We can afford to ship this oxaloacetate and make it a glucose and have it leave the cell. So that's why entering here is glucogenic. What if we enter over here? Or over here, this one's clear, right? Acetoacetate to ketone. That one makes sense. Doesn't even need to explain it. This one, why is it making an acetyl-CoA? Because it seems like it would just go through the entire way and just also make a glucose. Well, because if an acetyl-CoA goes in, again, you got to remember, we got a fixed pool. If I make an acetyl-CoA and I push that in, I'm now taking an oxaloacetate, and then that's going all the way around. And then if that leaves, I just lost one oxaloacetate. I'm depleting the pool. So that won't happen. So the point is that if you do this, its only recourse is to make acetoacetate. Now, a lot of things can be ketogenic and glucogenic, right? They have different possibilities. They can have one entry point or another entry point. But I would know, and then so some things are both, some things are ketogenic, some things are just glucogenic. I would just know that leucine and lysine are the ones that are only ketogenic. So when we do this though, so we're skipping how do I make this an acetyl-CoA? How do I make that an alpha-glutarate? How do I make that acetyl-CoA? It doesn't matter, but you do need to know there's, sure as shit not a nitrogen in any of these Krebs cycle proteins or molecules. So there's always a deamination reaction. Every time we're doing this, we're taking away a nitrogen, and nitrogen is quite toxic to the body. So the question is, where does the nitrogen go? We have to excrete it. We excrete it. Anytime we need to do some weird metabolic thing, it's going to go to the liver, right? So In the muscles, we might be breaking down a bunch of proteins and breaking down a bunch of amino acids. We have a lot of ammonium. Ammonium's toxic, like we said, so we need to get it to the liver so we can do the urea cycle and we can excrete it in the urine, right? Urea, urine. And the question is, how do we get it there? And this was just kind of a cute, fun thing. So we make urea, us mammals, and we have an access to like a medium amount of water. And if you look at something like a fish have tons of water available to them. So they don't actually need to convert the toxic ammonium to less toxic urea because they have so much water they can just dilute it. Something like a bird, on the other hand, has very little water. So they're going to have something that's even less toxic than urea. That's definitely not a new test. I'm a nerd, thought that was funny or interesting. So urea cycle happens in the liver. How do we get it there? The suspense is killing everybody. It's through something called the Cahill cycle. This is how we get nitrogen from the muscles to the liver. And to understand this, to really have it like click, you have to understand how glutamate acts as like a storage for ammonium. We need to know what the heck is a transaminase reaction. We need to know about alanine playing the role of the friendly shuttle, the vessel. It takes nitrogen through the blood. And then we have to understand like the fact that transaminases can work both ways. It's a reversible reaction, a reversible enzyme. And then this will all make sense. So glutamate, we've already seen this. So we break down amino acids, we break down nucleotides, we have a bunch of ammonium. You combine it with an alpha-ketoglutarate, you make a glutarate. I would know glutamate dehydrogenase. I would know that is the enzyme to do this. A transamination reaction, in general, is just we take an amino acid and a keto acid. All right, what's a keto acid? Well, a ketone is where you have, here's your carbonyl carbon, and there's a carbon on this side, and there's a carbon on that side. So that's the keto part. What about the acid? Well, this is my carbonyl, and my alpha carbon is a carboxylic acid, a keto acid. And it's really just swapping. The amino acid is going to become some keto acid because we're just swapping the ammonium for a double bond O. So amino acid becomes a keto acid, and the keto acid becomes some random amino acid. So just one specific example, right? That's the general thing is let's take glutamate, an amino acid, and pyruvate, here's our carbonyl carbon, is a ketone, and alpha carbon, it's carboxylic acid, a keto acid. Let's take these and let's swap. NH2 becomes C double bond O, and the double bond O becomes an N2, and you know what? And glutamate became alpha ketoglutarate, an alpha keto acid, and the alpha keto acid became an amino acid, alanine. So do you have to memorize every what keto acid becomes where, who, where, why? No, not really. Maybe just know the ones that I talked through in this lecture. I think that's really all you'd have to know. So we talked about transaminases. This is a specific one. Who cares? Why is it important, right? Well, glutamate might be a good storage for ammonium, but we're doing this in the muscle. I don't want to store it in the muscle. I want to get rid of it. How do I get it to the liver? Glutamate's not allowed through the blood for whatever reason, but alanine is. Alanine can move through the blood. So we convert it into alanine so that it can go to the blood so it can get to the liver. So, it's nitrogen, gets stored in alpha ketoglutarate to become glutamate. It also makes alpha ketoglutarate and glutamate. That might make it easy to remember. That, though, can't move through the blood, so we turn it into alanine. Alanine can move through the blood. All right, what's next? Well, just, reminder, enzymes and reactions can work both ways. It's often, they're reversible. So we saw that alpha ketoglutarate can become glutamate. We saw pyruvate can become alanine, but it goes both ways. So we saw alpha ketoglutarate become glutamate. We need to pick up that nitrogen. And then we said, let's move it through the blood. So then the glutamate becomes this, and that allows us to generate alanine. Okay, well, alanine's going to move through the blood. It's going to go to the liver. Great. Well, now it gets to the liver. We don't need alanine anymore. We, in fact, want to do another one of these reactions with the same thing. It's just reversible. I want my glutamate back. Why do I want my glutamate back? Because if I have my glutamate, I can also do the reverse of this just to make my ammonium pop up and I just have it now, not attached to some other molecule. This is so we can input it into the urea cycle. Also note that the pyruvate we can just do gluconeogenesis with this. We're in the liver, and we can ship it back to the muscles. So we're going to have glutamate, and it is going to help us make alanine. Alanine moves through the blood to the liver. We're going to turn it back to glutamate. Glutamate dehydrogenases, makes ammonium. We'll talk about that in a second. The alanine can become pyruvate, or does become pyruvate automatically in that transamination reaction. Gluconeogenesis makes glucose. You know what? The muscles are pretty hungry. They use a lot of energy. We can just ship that back to the muscles, and then it can turn that into one, it's going to use this for energy, but it also might make pyruvate, which again can just be an input here. So that is the Cahill cycle. It's very analogous to something we talked about earlier, which was the Cori cycle, which isn't relevant here. It's simply just, I'm putting it up so you can make a comparison, an analogy, a connection, that if I'm doing anaerobic respiration, lactic acid fermentation, glucose makes pyruvate. Yes, that usually goes to acetyl-CoA, but not if you don't have enough oxygen. It makes lactate. Lactate can go through the blood. Gluconeogenesis means that I can get a glucose back, and then I can send it back in. So Cori's cycle is very similar to the Cahill cycle, but the Cahill cycle is the only one that's relevant for nitrogen stuff. Overview. Break down shit. Get ammonium. Put it in alpha-ketoglutarate. Get a glutamate. Yay. Oh, no, wait a second. Glutamate is not allowed in the blood. Okay, we'll combine that with a pyruvate transamination reaction. That makes an alanine. Notice the names for these enzymes. Glutamate dehydrogenase, alanine transaminase. Why? Because we're making alanine. Alanine goes through the blood over here, comes to the liver. Great. Alanine's done its job. Let's make glutamate again. We combine it with alpha-keto acid with an amino acid. And this is a reversible enzyme, so it's still called alanine transaminase, and we make a glutamate, which has an NH3 and a pyruvate. Gluconeogenesis makes glucose. Glucose goes through the blood. Boom, that's the Cahill cycle. Now, this glutamate can have a glutamate dehydrogenase rip off the NH3, and that is now where our story continues. So, great, we made an NH3, NH4, but again, we don't like it. It's toxic, so we need to do something about it. And that's where we're going to put it into the urea cycle. Our NH4 is here, put it into the urea cycle. I very much would know that the first two steps of the urea cycle happen in the mitochondria, and everything else is taking place in the cytosol. At least this part. We're going to see that this gets a little bit more complicated, and I'm actually not sure where that second part goes, but I don't think the last that. So first two steps, mitochondria, last of it in the cytosol. CO2, or sometimes said to be bicarb, and ammonium are going to combine and form something called carbamoyl phosphate. They do this with carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. This is the rate limiting step, and why 1? Well, because there's a second one that works. Again, this is in the mitochondria. The first two steps involving this feller and this feller are in the mitochondria. So this is in the mitochondria. We have a CPS2 for nucleotides that happens in the cytosol. That is important to know and to make that distinction. So CPS1 is the rate limiting step. It just combines carbon dioxide and ammonium. It is activated by something called NAG. NAG is really just glutamate with some sort of acetyl compound on it. When would we have so glutamate is basically NAG. It's just like a modified glutamate. When would this happen? If there's too much protein in your diet, you're breaking down a lot of protein, and then you need to break down a lot of those amino acids, which means you have a lot of nitrogen to deal with. But probably more likely is there's some sort of starvation going on, and your body's gotten to a point where it's like, you know what, we actually need to break down a lot of proteins and a lot of amino acids. So you have a ton of nitrogen, and all of this extra nitrogen means that we must have more urea cycle happening in the liver to safely convert it into urea for excretion. So we take that carbamoyl phosphate, and we now are going to combine it with ornithine. So the name kind of makes sense because the reactions are ornithine and carbamoyl phosphate. And so this is ornithine, named after one of the reactions, transcarbamylase. So this is the ornithine transcarbamylase. And now it makes it citrulline, which is going to be outside of the mitochondria in the cytosol now. Now this is going to pair with the kind of the Krebs cycle, but a little bit of other stuff. So an aspartate is going to combine with the citrulline, which is really just going to finish the process to help us make urea. But where are we just going to get an aspartate? I mean, I suppose you could just, how are we going to make our aspartates? What's going to happen? we can actually have another entry point in terms of like dumping off nitrogens for the urea cycle. So we have an amino acid over here, which we also want to get rid of that nitrogen. And so this is going to be aspartate transaminase, where we have oxaloacetate, which is a keto acid, and some random amino acid. They combine and we make a different keto acid and this. So in the same way that we just said alpha ketoglutarate becomes glutamate, oxaloacetate becomes aspartate. And the aspartate is going to become fumarate, but which really just means it's dumped off another nitrogen. And you really don't have to picture every single weird step that's coming in. I very much would just know that these are coupled and that there is a second entry point now for a nitrogen through this aspartate. So just to really highlight, maybe not, to make an important point, kind of a side note actually, alanine transaminase in the muscle and in the liver. Here we're talking about the liver. We need a lot of it, right? Because alanine has been shipped through the blood to the liver, and then, well, we don't want it to be alanine, we want it to be glutamate so we can rip off the nitrogen easily. A lot of ALT there. AST, we said that's the urea cycle, right? Aspartate is an input, and to make aspartate from some random amino acid, we need AST. So a lot of this in the liver. Who cares? Well, this is, if a hepatic cell dies, AST, ALT normally safely in the liver. But if it dies, the liver is sick or whatever, AST and ALT will spill out of the cell into the plasma. So we can use this as a marker for hepatic function or your liver pathology. I want to know how healthy you are and your liver is. I can use the amount of plasma, AST and ALT to help me understand it. Now, for whatever weird reason, ALT is, so if you have a bad liver, both of these levels will go up. But for whatever reason, ALT goes up a little bit more than AST. Unless it's alcoholic liver disease, in which case AST goes up more than ALT. And you remember this by thinking that you make a toast with alcohol. All right, so here's everything again. Let's just try to understand where things are coming from and where they're going. So urea, our whole point is to get rid of these little nitrogens right there. Well, you know what? If you look at an arginine, and there's two arginines. So the immediate, where do the two nitrogens from the urea come from? They come from the arginine. Okay, but like originally, where do they come from? Remember, we're breaking down amino acids and nucleotides, and so here's our urea. This is what it looks like. This first nitrogen comes from the breakdown of the muscle, and that's the glutamate, the alanine, back to glutamate, and then this is where the nitrogen comes in originally. And then this other one we said was the aspartate. The aspartate is really what's contributing this second nitrogen. Again, this was like we had the two cycles together, like the half Krebs and this. This is where the aspartate comes in. So what happens if we have too much nitrogen, too much ammonia? Well, how can it be caused, actually? Liver failure, by far, is the most common one. If you drink too much, if you have hepatitis, if you have fatty liver disease, these things can affect hepatic function, and you can't do the urea cycle as well, and you're just going to have ammonium build up, and that's probably the main way. I would know this... all of these genetic things are relatively rare, but there's a spectrum of rarity. All of these diseases are randomly rare, but this one's actually more common than some of the other ones. So ornithine transcarbamylase is an X-linked disorder, and it causes something called orotic acid to build up. And this might seem weird because, wait a second, okay, ornithine transcarbamylase makes carbamoyl phosphate. The precursors are carbamoyl phosphate and ornithine. They combines them. So if this enzyme doesn't work, shouldn't those accumulate? Yes, if that was, remember that this was, we had CPS1 and CPS2. So it turns out there's another use of carbamoyl phosphate that is in nucleotide metabolism. And so it actually turns out that the carbamoyl phosphate is going to be turned into something called orotic acid, which we'll talk about in a hot second with nucleotide metabolism. So ornithine transcarbamylase, X-linked disorder, orotic acid is going to build up. Typically, if you have too much ammonium in the blood, that means your liver's not working, and the urea cycle is not working, and so that means you're not generating as much urea. So your BUN levels are going to go down. What are the effects of this? It's mostly going to have CNS effects. Why? Well, there's a lot of glutamine synthetase in the brain. So we said alpha-ketoglutarate can store one nitrogen, become glutamate. And then we said glutamate can store a second nitrogen, become glutamine. Why would there be a bunch of glutamine synthetase in the brain? One is the brain's really vulnerable and vulnerable to ammonium toxicity. And so it can, it's kind of the lesser of two evils, maybe, that if an ammonium gets up there, it can just slap it onto a glutamate and have glutamine. Ultimately it's going to backfire because this is going to cause edema, which we'll talk about that right now. So glutamine is very osmotically active and it attracts water. So if you have a lot of ammonium, your brain's going to turn all of that, it's going to combine it with glutamate to make a lot of glutamine. That attracts a lot of water. You get cerebral edema, which is going to cause symptoms we'll talk about in a second. So, I guess that it's, would we rather have ammonium toxicity in the brain or too much glutamine, which brings in fluid? So that is just one reason. The way that I think about it, though, is that glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter of the brain. It's very common. And so eventually we want to turn off this glutamate or recycle it or do something with it. And so astrocytes, which are dealing with neurotransmitter metabolism, they're going to take those glutamates and they're going to slap on a nitrogen to turn them into glutamine for whatever reason. So again, all of this is simply to explain and help you remember why we should expect there to be a lot of glutamine synthetase in the brain. Nevertheless, again, the whole main actual consequence is that you have too much water, which follows all of this glutamine now that is accumulating in the brain, causes edema. And if you have too much fluid in the brain, you have increased intracranial pressure, too much pressure because there's too much fluid in the brain. This causes the optic disc on your basically on your retina in the back of your eye to bulge. So now this is normal, and this is a bulging one. It's actually probably better pictures than that, but you guys don't really have to know exactly what papilledema is and what it looks like. Just maybe be aware of the term. Increased intracranial pressure can cause vomiting, speech, somnolescence, and you know what? The big one, asteriscus. So if you ask a patient who you suspect to have hyperammonemia to hold out their arms and extend their wrists, they will start flapping their arms like crazy. And this is called asterixis, and it's very specific and high yield as an indicator for too much nitrogen in the blood. Pivoting towards nucleotides. So we're going to be talking about anabolic, catabolic, and salvage pathway as well. Just quick refresher on nucleotides. We have deoxy versus oxy. DNA does not have an OH there on the two. Oxy for RNA does have an OH on the two. C's and G's are going to have 3 hydrogen bonds in a double strand. A's and T's are going to have just 2. I always remember that C is the third letter of the alphabet. 5' to 3'. So if we just look at this 1, 2, 3, 4 tetranucleotide sequence, the carbon over here, carbon number 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Carbon number 5 is not attached to another nucleotide. So this is the 5' end. And if we go over the other side, well, carbon number 5 is attached to something. Okay, well, that's not interesting. So then it must be carbon number 3, because that's not attached to anything. So I know that this is the 3' end. Pure as gold, purines, adenine, guanine. We all know that. We've heard that. But I would remember that it's pure as gold ingots. Ingots shown over here because inosine is going to be an important purine precursor as well that you might not have heard as much about before. And then cut the pie, pyrimidines are cytosine, uracil, and thymine. Of course, uracil is only an RNA, and thymine is going to be DNA. I would know the shape. Pyrimidine is this, while purine is this. I don't know why in my head, but I always thought like, you could stuff a lot of pyramids in the pyrimidine a little bit more. And then I also thought, like, I guess if the pyrimidine was a shape, you could build a pyramid out of the shape. So if you want to think about pyramids fitting in a pyrimidine or pyrimidines building a pyramid, more so than purines, for whatever weird reason, that worked for me. Maybe that's me specific, though. All right, anabolic. Let's build some purines. What's going on? So we got glucose, pentose phosphate pathway. This gives us ribulose 5-phosphate, which can isomerize to ribose 5-phosphate, shown We then can PRPP phosphoribosylate pyrophosphate synthetase. Bunch of fancy stuff just to say we put a pyrophosphate right here on carbon number 1. We've now made the ring. We have made the ring, and I guess put the phosphate on as well. Now, the first step after this, amidophosphorybosyl transferase. This is the rate limiting step. Really, all this does is swap this with a nitrogen group. Probably not even that important to know what that is. Maybe I would know that this is the rate limiting step. And then we're doing a whole bunch of other steps. Not important to know. Know that we're putting in things like glycine, glutamine, formate, aspartate, and you can actually kind of trace these to see where they end up in the purine. At the end of all of this, we're going to have inosine monophosphate. Now, keep in mind, we are talking about the production of RNA for all of this, as we can see with this 2' carbon. Pure as gold ingots here, inosine. Inosine, so we now made the nitrogen base on top of the ring, right? Here was our ring, we made that first, and then here was our nitrogen base, we made that second. We can now make this into AMP or GMP. That's how you make a purine. Negative feedback as expected. You got enough GMP, it's going to go negatively feedback. Got enough AMP, negatively feedback. Got enough INP, negative feedback, right? Just you should have an intuition about what the feedback should be like. Pyrimidines. Same making the ring step, right? Ribulose 5-phosphate becomes PRPP. So just memorize PRPP as the base nucleotide, the base ring. The base ring. No, I should, as just the ribose sugar, right? So when I say base, I'm saying as like the fundamental unit, not to be confused with the nitrogen base. So I misspoke. It's confusing. Okay, so here we made our simple ring, which we want to attach our nitrogen base to. Previously, we did all of this, and then we did the nitrogen base. Second, these are kind of happening like in parallel. So now we're making the nitrogen base. Ammonium and carbon dioxide. That sounds familiar. That's the beginning of the urea cycle, if you think about it. Ammonium and carbon dioxide, and that makes carbamoyl phosphate. But remember, that was carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. This is synthetase 2. And if you remember, the first 2 steps of the urea cycle happen in the mitochondria. This happens in the cytosol. They love to ask little shitty questions like that. So I would just know that this is all in the cytosol. In the urea cycle, it was a long track of the muscle would break down, make a nitrogen, put it in a glutamate, put it in alanine, ship it through the blood, get it to the liver, convert the alanine back to a glutamate, and rip off the nitrogen from the glutamate. That's where it is. Here, it actually comes from a glutamine. Anyways, we made our carbamoyl phosphate. Great. Carbamoyl phosphate then combined with ornithine in the urea cycle via the enzyme ornithine transcarbamylase. Well, in this case, it's going to be carbamoyl phosphate that combines with aspartate. And similarly, it's in the urea cycle we had carbamoyl phosphate and ornithine. And the enzyme is named after ornithine transcarbamylase. This one is kind of similar in that it's not named after carbamoyl phosphate. It's named after the other thing, the aspartate, or the other thing, which was previously ornithine and is now aspartate. This is aspartate transcarbamylase. Also recall, anachronistically, I mentioned earlier that if you have an ornithine transcarbamylase enzyme deficiency, a genetic deficiency, you will have a buildup in orotic acid. Now we know why. Because in the urea cycle, you would get a lot of this and you couldn't really do anything with it. Well, that was for the urea cycle. It's going to escape the mitochondria, make its way to the cytosol where it will react with aspartate transcarbamylase and make a lot of orotic acid. So the orotic acid buildup hopefully makes sense now. We've now made the nitrogen base, we made the ring, but now we got to slap them together. So UMP synthetase is going to combine these two, and then from there, we can make it into cytosine and thymine. And again, we have been dealing with these ribose structures. That's when we're doing pyrimidine and purine anabolic processes, we're making RNA. So if we're making a thymine, that's just by definition DNA. So you need to do ribonucleotide reductase, which, if we're going to reduce something, we're going to get rid of an oxygen bond and or gain a hydrogen bond. And that's exactly what happens, right? This becomes a hydrogen. Well, that's how we get it from RNA to DNA. What about the fact that uracil and thymine have different nitrogen bases? Well, we're just going to add a methyl group via thymidylate synthetase. And remember that this uses from vitamin B9, vitamin B12, all of that fun pathway. 5,10 methylene THF is going to add that methyl there. Negative feedback as expected. Bam, 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 right? The downstream things inhibit the previous steps. We saw this for uracil making thymine, but it's going to happen for any time, we want to make an RNA nucleotide into a DNA nucleotide. We have this, and then we reduce it to become we add a hydride. Negative feedback as expected, right? If you have enough DNTP, it's going to come back and inhibit this. So ribose 5-phosphate becomes PRPP, and this does a whole bunch of steps to make IMP, which goes here or here. Well, if you have 6, so a lot of these are chemotherapy drugs. Some of them are immunosuppressive drugs. 6-mercaptopurine. Purine azathioprine. Technically azathioprine, I think, just becomes 6-mercaptopurine. But I would just note the purine. So this is going to be a competitive inhibitor for somewhere in this process. Important to know. If we go the other route, remember we had glutamine, which had the nitrogen and CO2. CPS2 makes carbamoyl phosphate combined with aspartate via aspartate transcarbamylase. We make orotic acid. We now combine that with a PRPP to make the uracil. Ultimately, that makes cytosine. And, we want to make a thymine, but remember, we got to do ribonucleotide reductase. Well, hydroxyurea, we're kind of random. This will inhibit ribonucleotide reductase. And just let's make super clear, it's not just inhibiting this one instance. We're going to say it's inhibiting everywhere. Anytime you want to take an RNA to a DNA, hydroxyurea is going to inhibit that. Also, hydroxyurea, just random note, we saw it as a treatment for sickle cell, and that is going to induce fetal hemoglobin production. 5-fluorouracil, again, you should just think about the name. The name uracil, is it going to affect anywhere on the purine side? No, it's going to specifically affect the pyrimidine side. It's probably going to act as a competitive inhibitor. It competes and inhibits thymidylate synthase, which again is interacting with 5,10 methylene THF. Methotrexate, we said, is a competitive inhibitor here, and TMP, which is a component of Bactrim, is going to also inhibit this. Breaking things down. Pyrimidines are simple and boring, and probably not going to get that many questions. These puppies break down to malonyl-CoA. This breaks down to methyl-malonyl-CoA. This should make sense. What's the difference between a uracil and a thymine? A thymine has an extra methyl group. So this is 3 carbons, and this is 3 carbons plus this carbon over there. But this is low yield. Much higher yield is this. We did pyrimidine, catabolism. Now let's look at purine catabolism. So all of these are nucleotides. IMP normally becomes AMP and GMP. That's not a breakdown. Now the breakdown is that IMP, AMP, and GMP can all lose their phosphate. If you lose your phosphate, there's 3 things for a nucleotide. You got the phosphate, you got the ribose, and then or the deoxyribose or whatever. I'm just going to use them interchangeably for the most part, unless I'm making a very specific point. So the phosphate, the ribose, and the nitrogen base. First, we're going to take off the phosphate. Now it's a nucleoside. Adenosine, inosine, guanosine. Adenosine, and you should know this, and it's going to come up later in more genetic stuff, is that adenosine can be oxidized to inosine. So this is adenosine, maybe not oxidized. It can be converted to inosine, adenosine deaminase. We can then rip off the ribose sugar, or the deoxyribose, whatever. And now we're making we just have the nitrogen base. We have an adenine, hypoxanthine, and guanine. Adenine ADA can turn into hypoxanthine. We can now break these down. Guanine can be broken down into xanthine. Hypoxanthine can also be broken down into xanthine via the enzyme xanthine oxidase and guanine deaminase, respectively. Xanthine oxidase then works, and this is where it gets its namesake, it then works on xanthine. It is going to break down xanthine, it's going to oxidize it into uric acid, which is very important for a couple diseases we'll talk about in a second. This can theoretically be converted to allantoin, which is a bit more water soluble, and some medications try to, exploit that. But this is the entire breakdown. This is how we break things down, but we want to be very green, right? We want to recycle as much as we can. We want to make cuts and be effective where possible. So there's what we call a salvage pathway where we can, as we're breaking stuff down, our body goes, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't throw this out. Maybe we can actually put this back in the system rather than making another one from start. So these are just the nitrogen bases. Remember that PRPP is just the ribose unit, the fundamental unit with the phosphate. So if you could just slap them together, you can just get back to your nucleotide again. And that's exactly what this enzyme does. Hypoxanthine guanine phosphoribal transferase. So phosphoryl transferase means transferring, adding it to. And hypoxanthine and guanine, well, notice it only works on hypoxanthine and it only works on guanine. It takes a guanine and combines it with a PRPP, and boom, booyah, you got a normal looking G nucleotide. Hypoxanthine can make an I nucleotide, which can then, of course, just become an AMP and GMP. So wait, does that mean that it's the name is very specific. Hypoxanthine guanosine phosphoribosal transferase. It only works on these two. It doesn't work on adenine. Does that mean adenine can't be salvaged? No, because remember, adenine, adenosine, doesn't matter. Both of these can be converted to this middle pathway. And if we make it to inosine or hypoxanthine, that can then just go up ahead and again be salvaged. So it's indirectly salvaged by being converted to inosine or hypoxanthine. So that to me that's a lot. Like, I do think this is stuff you should know, but you want to simplify it. This is probably going to get you majority of questions. Purines are broken down via a lot of random ass processes to hypoxanthine. Keep in mind that you do need ADA technically to break down the adenosine and the adenine, because you got to convert it to inosine or hypoxanthine. But there's a bunch of things to break it down. So purines become hypoxanthine, and then xanthine via xanthine oxidase becomes uric acid. That is the catabolic side. The salvage side is, maybe we could just recycle this nitrogen base by adding on a PRPP. And so hypoxanthine guanine phosphoribosal transferases are going to combine, PRPP plus our nitrogen base, and boom, we got a nucleotide. So this is how the salvage is working. So when we're breaking things down, a couple deficiencies that you could have, an ADA deficiency, you can't break down your adenosine, it's going to accumulate and it's going to cause SCID. Which we'll talk about in a second. Xanthine oxidase, this is important. It is a target for people with gout. We use allopurinol or febuxostat, which I think is less common for some reason. And on the salvage side, again, ADA could also be considered a catabolic issue and also a salvage issue because it's kind of you've got to catabolize something to salvage it to a certain point, and ADA doesn't let you catabolize it. So if you can't catabolize, you can't salvage it. So that's why we see this show up on both sides. But it's important, you need to know it. But I don't want to inflate the importance. So I'm talking about it a lot because I personally found it confusing. So ADA deficiency could theoretically be catabolic or salvage. More importantly is this one, and this one, in my opinion, HGPRT. Could cause gout, but more importantly, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. So SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome. In other words, your T cells suck. There's a lot of different ways we can cause this. The main one is that 46% of cases, the gamma chain on your T cells doesn't respond to cytokines, and this is X-linked. But you know what? The one that probably is relevant is going to be the one with the enzyme of nucleotide metabolism. So an ADA deficiency. This is autosomal recessive, and you can't break down the adenosines. So if we break down, if we get rid of those enzymes, this is just going to become some sort of toxic, random stuff. And This is bad for the lymph nodes and it causes the T cells to die. But also, you can't salvage, and if you can't salvage, you probably can't make enough nucleotides to keep up with the replication rate. So this could also affect like T cell production in the bone marrow. And you know, the Boy in the Bubble and silly Jake Gyllenhaal movie is based on this. Gout, called the disease of kings. We'll see why. It's like a type of arthritis due to, like, if you have too much uric acid in the blood, it becomes something called monosodium urate, and it starts, for whatever reason, clumping together, and then it deposits in joints, and it causes an immune response, which just generates a lot of pain. So where does it accumulate? Podagra is the fact that it typically is going to accumulate and cause a lot of pain on the MTP joint of the big toe. It's probably going to be asymmetric. You know, it's going to affect, because we're just talking about like these uric acid things floating around in the blood. And so it's like, it will happen on both sides, but it'd be weird if it was exactly equal deposition on both sides. So that might be a way to distinguish this from like just arthritis. Also, you know, if it goes to the big toe, you might think gout. You're also going to get what's called a tophus, where it's depositing in the skin, and you can see right there to develop. 90% of the causes is actually just the fact that you have an issue with your kidneys, or you're on diuretics, and so your body can't get rid of the uric acid the way that it normally does in the urine, and so it's just going to build up, and it groups together, clumps together, deposits in joints, causes a lot of pain. Could be the case though that you're overproducing. Less common, could be the case. So HGPRT deficiency. So let me think. Yeah, so typically we want to recycle hypoxanthine and push it upwards in the cycle, right? To remake our nucleotides. If that's the case, well, then I'm not going to break down as much hypoxanthine to xanthine to uric acid. So the salvaging is good because it's good to recycle, but it also prevents us creating this toxic uric acid. So if you have an issue there, you're going to have more uric acid. Von Gehrig's disease, you can't do glucose 6 phosphatase. So you can't push glucose out of your blood and your liver. And remember that glucose can go make glycogen, it can make acetyl-CoA, it can be pushed out of the blood, which we can't now, and it can also do the pentose phosphate pathway. So if you can't push it out, then you got more glucose, and some of it's going to be shunted in the pentose phosphate pathway, which means we're going to have, and one of the things that PPP does is that it makes the ribose sugar unit, and so we're going to have more of this. You might have more nucleotides and therefore more breakdown and more uric acid. Tumor lysis syndrome. If you have a tumor, cells are dividing a lot. There's a lot of nucleotide generation. You're making a lot of nucleotides. You're breaking down. You have tons of uric acid in your cancer. And you know what? Those cells are shitty, and they're dying, and they're spilling uric acid in the blood. And it's called tumor lysis syndrome. This is one of the many features of tumor lysis syndrome. But spilling the nucleotides and the uric acid into the blood, this can cause gout. Additionally, now the surgery, the trauma, you get into a car accident, you have surgery, it's not necessarily like the cancer, you're making a lot of nucleotides, but it is the second part where if you're damaging a bunch of cells, they're going to spill a bunch of nucleotides out in the blood. That can cause too much uric acid, which can cause gout. Now, that's like, those are the underlying causes we just talked about. But it can be exact. So someone might have a gout and then just not have an attack for a couple of weeks, or they're fine. And then suddenly they have a big attack. What might precipitate it? What might exacerbate it? Meat and fish and alcohol. And that's something that like wealthy people used to eat. So this disease has obviously been around for a long time, and they just noticed that wealthy people got it because they're eating all of these rich foods and drinking a lot. That's why it's called the disease of kings. Meat and fish, a lot of nucleotides, a lot of uric acid, boom. Alcohol, dehydration. If you dehydrate, you're going to have less fluid in your blood, which means however much uric acid you have, the concentration is now higher. And if the concentration higher, it's more likely to precipitate and deposit. Also, alcohol is going to compete for the same transporter that is going to help secrete uric acid into the urine. Treatments, allopurinol and febuxostat. So how are these working? Hypoxanthine is made into xanthine. Xanthine is made into uric acid. Same enzyme twice, xanthine oxidase. Well, if you inhibit it with either of these two things, you can't make uric acid. Hypoxanthine levels will accumulate. Maybe you'll have more salvage. Maybe this is discarded some other way. Maybe it's just less toxic. Who cares? But the point is we're not making uric acid. So hooray, this will help. Remember that part of the pain is because, yeah, you're just depositing a lot of these urate, monosodium urate crystals into your joints. But then the immune system, kind of like with the macrophages and the phone cells, is trying to help, but it's just doing a shitty job. It's just making things worse. So you actually want to inhibit the immune system, and that actually might cause less pain. So that's where NSAIDs and corticosteroids, and we saw this is inhibiting the arachidonic pathway, right? And colchicine, which is inhibiting microtubule polymerization, which is necessary for neutrophil chemotaxis. All of this is just trying to disable the immune response so that we have a little bit less pain. Uric acid levels should be higher. I hope that one makes sense. Notice, though, that theoretically you could have normal sodium and plasma levels. Actually, you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, theoretically, I guess your urinary uric acid levels could be higher or lower. If you're under-excreting, theoretically, your urine acid levels could be higher. So mostly what we're looking here for the lab findings is the plasma uric acid levels. So they might be higher, and that should make sense. But what's interesting is they might actually be normal. For reasons that I don't really know. They might be normal. So someone comes in, so this could be on your test. They go, but the person's uric acid. It's a trick. It's a trick question because theoretically the uric acid levels could look normal. And it's for whatever reason there's still too much and there's still the deposition of the crystals and whatnot. Also, you'll see yellow-blue like needle-shaped crystals that have a negative bifringence, which is this test they do where the refractive index of something is going to vary depending on the polarization of light. I don't think you don't need to understand like the physics of it too much. Just yellow-blue, needle-shaped crystals, negative bifringence. Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. So an HGPRT deficiency, so we see this right here. So if this is inhibited, you know what? This actually should be over here. It's in the wrong spot. HGPRT. Boom, it's right there. So it's part of the salvage, right? So purines are broken down to hypoxanthine. Xanthine is broken down into xanthine, which is then broken down into uric acid. Uric acid can be recycled via HGPRT. If we do not have this, you cannot recycle, which means you have more uric acid. Well, again, this is one of the things that can cause gout. But then it also causes this whole other slew of things in this particular case, which is the Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. So more uric acid. Here you will definitely have more uric acid in the urine. And again, I'm glad I made that clarification earlier because remember the other case, most causes of gout, 90% of them are because your kidneys aren't working. You can't properly pee urine out. So the uric acid levels could be low, could be high in the urine. Here they're going to be high because your kidneys work fine. It's just the fact that you can't salvage, which means you're creating extra uric acid. And these crystals, it looks like sand in the urine, and then there could be blood because it's damaging the endothelial layers. So that's one aspect. Another aspect then is that, you're probably going to ramp up more de novo synthesis because you're not salvaging, but it just might not be able to, I don't know the rates, but maybe it's not so easy just to ramp up the de novo pathway and completely compensate for the lack of a salvage pathway. It might be the case that even though you ramp this up, you still just have less nucleotides, which means you're not developing properly. You need a lot of cell division to grow and mature, and it's just not enough to for embryogenesis and just general development to occur normally. It's X-linked. X-linked typically means mostly boys, some girls. I think this would be all boys because I assume that there's very little reproduction, if any, for someone afflicted with Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. It's quite severe condition. Intellectual disability, very, 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 very interesting and unique and horrifying clinical finding is the hyperaggression combined with the intellectual disability and maybe some other stuff. That there's self-mutilation. Often they have to have their arms pinned down. Sometimes they have to have some sort of mouth guard or something to prevent them. They'll bite their lips off and they will try to bite their fingers. They'll bite their fingers off. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. They also have dystonia, and so they're just going to have sporadic muscle spasms. Whew, okay, that was it. Great. I really hope I got this out to you guys in time. If not, I'm sorry. I'll try to get the next one out sooner. I hope everyone's doing really well and kind of getting off to a good, start to med school and trying to find their pace and everything. So, all the best, guys and gals. Sorry.